No? Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Before we get started with our ESSA discussion, I'd like everybody to rise, and I'm going to ask Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond to lead us in a moment of reflection.
Okay, I'm not familiar with what moments of reflection are these days, but I think that this is a important moment in New York, and one that we should take time to reflect on as the beginning of a whole new era in education in the state. So in whatever way feels good to you, take a moment to reflect on that.
Thank you. Okay, be seated. Okay, before we start, I'd like to make a brief statement, and before we turn it over to the commissioner, that this is a vision plan for New York State. Yes, as most of you know, we have a technical plan for USDOE that will become our New York State plan as a symbol of our commitment to our communities and our students. This is about all of us being public servants committed to serving the whole child. This is about courageous leaders who champion those who, quote, often have no access to the corridors of power. As former President Obama said recently as he received the Profile and Courage Award. Regent Norwood, last year you reminded us about a year ago that we cannot change the direction of the wind, but we can adjust the sails to reach our destination. Today, we are adjusting our sails because, as someone once said, the road to success is always under construction. With that note,
Great way to put it.
I turn it over to our commissioner.
Thank you, Chancellor. So I'd just like to briefly go through the work that we have been involved in over the last several months. We've engaged in extensive professional development to understand the new law and the opportunities it provides, including, not limited to, meetings with the United States Department of Ed, Brunstein and Manisfet, the law firm recognized for federal education regulation and legislative practice. We've been working closely with the Council of Chief State School Officers, which has provided access to many national experts, including two of the three people that we have relied heavily on, Linda Darling-Hammond from the Learning Policy Institute, Scott Marion from the Center for Assessment, Brian Gong from the Center for Assessment, Kenji Hakuda from Stanford, Delia Pampa from the Migration Policy Institute, Jean Wilhut from the National Center for Innovation in Education, and Susie Saavedra from the National Urban League. We've met approximately monthly with the Title I committees of practitioners to discuss ESSA. We've established the ESSA think tank with representatives from over 100 organizations, many of whom are here with us today. The think tank has met at least monthly since June, with work groups having met twice a month, supporting all students, supporting English language learners, excellent educators, challenging academic standards and assessments, accountability methodologies, measurements, and supports and improvement for schools. And we've engaged heavily with the Center for Assessment, Learning Policy Institute, EdFirst, and CCSSO to strategically plan the development of a draft state ESSA plan based on the Regent direction and stakeholder feedback. We've developed characteristics of highly effective schools, guiding principles and high concept ideas. And as each of these were developed, they came to the Regents in your meetings for your feedback and then to get feedback from the public when we put them out for additional comment. We posted an online survey to gather stakeholder preferences to potential indicators, and we received over 2,400 responses. We held more than 120 fall and winter regional in-person meetings across the state in coordination with the state's 37 boards of cooperative educational service, our BOCES, and the superintendents of the state's 5 largest city school districts, that more than 4,000 students, parents, teachers, school and district leaders, and school board members and other stakeholders attended. We opened an online survey to solicit additional individual feedback, and as you know, we are scheduled to be across the state in 13 regional meetings where we anticipate getting additional feedback. I want to point out to you the timeline for this plan. This May meeting, we present a draft to you. The department will release the plan and accept public comment on the draft plan starting tomorrow. Public hearings will last from May 11th to June 16th. We will have a July Board of Regents meeting. The staff will present any changes to the draft plan based on public comment and request permission to send the revised state plan to the governor. The application will be with the governor for 30 days, and in September, at our September board meeting, staff will seek approval to submit the final plan to the U.S. DOE. The deadline to submit the final plan is September 18th, right after our Regents meeting. Just before we get into the meat of this work and the discussions, you're going to ask yourself as you go through this, my goodness, this looks like a lot of work. I hope you've all seen that. I want to point out to you, as the Chancellor pointed out and Linda said, this is a new approach and new look at education in New York State. We have all taken it very seriously. We've listened to feedback from across the state, stakeholders, and especially from you. And I want to point out now the section leads for each of the key areas for this work and ultimately for the documents that you have in front of you. We have Ira Schwartz, our Assistant Commissioner from the Office of Accountability. We have Carolyn Bulson from the Supervisor of Educational Testing, and Ross Garmill. We have Maxine Meadows-Schuford and Jason Harmon. We have Lizette Cologne-Collins, Kin Maung. We have Alexander Tricolinos, Stephen Early, Lisa Long, and Alexandra Presley. If you would please stand. These are the staff members. Where's Angelica's up there too. Angelica, make sure you stand. Lizette, you didn't get up on your feet. Get up. Thank you. And leading that was Joan Ebert, who's done an outstanding job of working with everyone and keeping most of us sane. And I want to point out to you the next group of people that was included is all of our partners. The think tank members who patiently came each month to Albany and worked with us and then had multiple meetings. The Title I Committee of Practitioners. I particularly want to point out the importance of the district superintendents, not only in organizing meetings, and they're wonderfully great at doing that, but also in making sure that their superintendents understand the importance of giving us feedback and constantly providing that through surveys, et cetera. And the other experts, particularly Linda, Scott, excuse me, for their guidance and development of the draft plan. So here we go into our plan. I'd like to introduce Linda Darling Hammond right now.
Hi.
Good morning.
Again, I was thinking this morning, many years ago, this is not turning on, but you can hear me? Yeah, good.
What is on?
Okay, great. 25 years ago, I was chairing the Curriculum and Assessment Council in New York State that was creating the New York State standards at that time. This is when Commissioner Tom Sobel was in the commissioner's chair. So we've come kind of a full cycle to the next set of standards. Now, these are 21st century standards that thousands of educators in the state have just finished developing and improving and launching this next era of how students will be educated. So it's just an exciting time to be part of the work that this great state is doing, and to see what the amount of energy from state education staff, the regents themselves, the educators across the state have been able to pull together. So as the commissioner said, this is, a process, and the chancellor is ably leading us in this process towards a new vision for the state. And we're going to present the plan today in a way that we hope will give you the opportunity to raise comments and questions that can be worked on over the coming months as it gets finalized, and that will ultimately, I think, create a coherent approach for the state. So you know that the Regents' mission has not changed in many ways, and that's a good thing. It emphasizes equitable access to the highest quality educational opportunities and positive learning environments so that every child is prepared for success in college, career, and citizenship. I hope you see the vision reflected in the plan. The guiding principles of the plan deal with a world-class curriculum, attention to achievement gaps, educator excellence and equity, school climate and student social and emotional well-being, the relationship of trust, cultural responsiveness, and respect that has to exist both within schools and between schools and family. The new accountability system that we're talking about today, based on multiple measures rather than a single test score, aligned to the goals of college, career, and citizenship readiness. The use of performance measures that provide incentives for schools to really offer greater opportunities to all students in a differentiated and flexible system. The theory of action is that if we focus on what matters for student achievement and what effective schools do to enable achievement, schools, districts, the state will evaluate and develop plans to address those needs and gaps with that vision in front of them, that investments will support school and educator capacity to implement those plans and practices, and that the state, as it supports continuous evaluation and improvement and intervenes as needed with evidence-based approaches, will support teaching and learning and closing of both opportunity gaps and achievement gaps. One of the things I just want to point out to you, because there's a lot of paper that you've received. There's a big fat draft plan that got shortened to a somewhat smaller public-facing plan, and you'll notice quite often when you're looking for things, they're not always in the public-facing plan. Sometimes they're in the draft plan, and we'll try to locate some of those things as we go along. But there is a very strong emphasis on equity, and New York is taking advantage of the opportunities in ESSA, what I call the equity nuggets that are planted in the law, as well as some of its own ideas to pursue greater equity. So there'll be many more of these, but I just wanted to highlight that the plan plans to prominently report per pupil spending so that that can be raised up and looked at, reporting and addressing inequalities in access to qualified teachers, and resources for low-performing schools, each of which triggers certain responses to rectify inequalities that are found. Resource allocation reviews annually in districts that have many identified schools, supporting districts to reduce socioeconomic and racial ethnic segregation in schools, and the ways by which this can be supported will emerge in a number of places in the plan. There are other areas of attention to equity, such as universal designs for learning, improving the quality and the equitable distribution of the workforce, policies that will better support homeless youth and those who are exiting neglected or delinquent facilities, and then lots of things in the state accountability system that are intended to help reduce gaps in performance and incentivize more equitable opportunities, support students to get their diploma, even if it takes more than 4 years, and so on. So that's the framework. And before we dive into the specifics, I just want to take a moment to see if there are comments or questions before we move into the actual elements of the plan. Commissioner Reyes.
In the third bullet, excuse me, on the page, on slide 14, could you explain developing policies to support homeless youth, those in or exiting neglected or delinquent facilities? I understand delinquent facilities, not sure what are neglected.
We're actually going to have a section on this later in the day, if you don't mind. Staff will be joining me and can get into the details.
Yes.
Okay.
Just the clarity.
Yep. Unless somebody wants to quickly answer that now. Ira, yeah.
Regent Reyes, the neglected and delinquent is the literal language of ESSA. We would typically refer to those as juvenile justice facilities. Juvenile justice facilities is the way we would normally talk about them.
And that's the language.
Yeah, just quickly applaud you for recognizing that sometimes with the circumstances of a child's life, they need 5 or 6 years to complete high school. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. The circumstances of their life greatly dictate their ability to finish in a truncated period of time. I just was very happy to see that emphasis as being okay and that we're going to support them.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been more concerned about is the overarching need for mention of good health care and development in terms of learning. And I haven't been able to see that in these documents. So maybe you could just comment on that. Because I think that's the key to, a lot of the key to learning is having good health.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that the state will be able to do is to support certain kinds of evidence-based interventions in schools. And among the things you can consider are things like community schools,
Right.
which will meet the evidence-based intervention standard. We're actually just finishing a study that demonstrates how it will meet the standard, which can then provide wraparound health services, mental health services,
Right.
before and after. I think that's going to be very important. There are references in the long version of the report to those needs and the fact that interventions should be selected to meet those, and I think that's something you could emphasize if you think it's an important part of the solution set, which I agree with you, it will be in many cases.
And we've had those community schools for a while now, and they really haven't wrapped around as you said they might. So it would be nice to focus on them.
Yeah, it would be useful to perhaps have a state strategy to support them and give the guidance and parameters that allow them to be as successful as possible.
2 years it's been done? No.
Oh, yeah, that's in social.
Perhaps you can explain for us the concept, universal design for learning, the first bullet. In the second bullet, could you expand upon what we mean by the workforce? And in the last bullet, where do we as a state agency hold ourselves accountable for reducing the gaps? This seems to be all focused on what happens externally, but what about holding ourselves accountable? Should there be a bullet?
Right. Universal design for learning is sort of a set of principles and practices that have been developed to be infused into both instruction, curriculum and instruction, and testing designs. It's part of what appears in the emerging expectations for the training of teachers, and it is also something that is a commitment on the part of the assessment folks who will be trying to design assessments that are also responsive to the various ways in which people process information, the various ways in which people demonstrate what they know, which are brought into a, rather than saying these are special things we're holding for special ed kids, that we try to have a multimodal way of teaching, curriculum, and assessment. Thank you, Angelica agrees.
That's the question at this point, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah.
And just point out that we will have additional points throughout the presentation this morning for comments and questions.
And then I didn't answer the other one, just to say that the distribution of staff refers to both teachers and leaders. I don't know if that's what you were asking.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question really piggybacks on Regent Johnson's. We are addressing several, all the way through this, the inequalities within a school district. Where or how can we address and put pressure on the people who can make decisions for the inequalities between school districts. That's the overarching concern that I have, and that hits a lot of our pieces, whether it's on diversification or inequality of resources, et cetera. I'm not sure what we can do, but I think we should be doing something to pressure those that can make those decisions.
And that's a big $64 million question, which you will all work on. But I would say that reporting and regularly raising up, analyzing, having regular reports about and discussions of the cross-district inequalities is part of setting the stage for state action that can address those. So we'll move along then and talk about the indicators. This is just a refresher in a way. Remember, we talked about the fact that there can be indicators, sort of we called them Tier 1, that are used for accountability in the federal system to identify schools that will receive support and intervention. But there are also very important indicators that can be used to report regularly on various features of schooling that are part of that setting the table for understanding what's happening, for diagnosing what's happening in schools, and for raising up issues of quality or inequality in the state that the state will pay attention to. So we propose that focusing on student learning and attainment, the accountability indicators would be defined for the ESSA plan. More work would go on to identify other state reported indicators, and then that outer ring should actually stay state-supported indicators, which are indicators, I'll talk about those again in a moment, that you can help local districts use in their systems. This is the set of indicators that are in the plan for federal accountability purposes. Scott is going to talk more about how they're going to be measured. But let me just point out where New York is plowing new ground. In addition to ELA and math assessments, New York will also include science and social studies. And moving beyond just a percent proficient measure, New York has a performance index, which is an advance over what was done under NCLB and what many other states are doing. English language proficiency gains are now part of the accountability system. It's a wonderful move on the part of ESSA to put English learners at the center of the work. New York is taking a very strong stand with respect to growth and progress, to giving schools credit both for the growth of individual students on assessments and the progress that the whole school makes on any indicator in all of the areas that are chosen. I think that's a very important new innovation in the system. As Regent Cashin mentioned, graduation rates will be 4-, 5-, and 6-year graduation rates, incentivizing schools to continue to work with and keep and bring back students so that they graduate. Chronic absenteeism, so that students who are not appearing for school are worked with, and we work with parents and with the students themselves to keep them there and bring them back. And then another innovation, very important, is the college career and civic readiness indicator for high school, which is an exciting indicator that will allow you to look at the kind of coursework that kids are accomplishing, the diplomas that they receive, CTE coursework and industry credentials, a seal of biliteracy, a very big statement for our country, I think, and a seal potentially to be designed and developed and approved of civic engagement. And those are things that will be worked on over coming years. Then in Tier 2, I'm not going to spend as much time on that, but there are a lot of indicators that could be reported that would allow you to keep track of the opportunities available, to have schools look at those annually as they are doing their own improvement, continuous improvement, and diagnostics. Some of these could, if you choose to, after you've developed them fully, move to Tier 1. They could become part of the accountability system. So those are things to be working on and thinking about over time. They're not ready at this moment with the data and the analysis that would be needed, but they could selectively move to Tier 1. Obviously, you don't want too many Tier 1 indicators, so that would be a judgment that would have to be made. But they're still valuable to have them regularly reported and analyzed and put before the public at the local level and at the state level. And so those could include things like opportunity to learn indicators, curriculum access, are kids getting art, music, PE, social studies, early learning. Recall that Connecticut actually has arts access as one of its accountability indicators. Resource access, dollars, qualified and experienced teachers, staffing ratios, counselors and teachers and so on. Teacher turnover and attendance, which we know predicts achievement to a great extent. Safe, adequate, clean facilities, so that as schools are looking themselves at how to improve, if schools are identified for support and intervention, these data will be available for us to really say what's going on here. What needs to be supported? What needs to be changed? How do we improve? School safety, teacher learning opportunities, a high school readiness indicator might be something that gets developed so that you know whether 8th graders are ready for what goes on. Usually those have things like grades and attendance and sometimes suspension rates in them. Some states are using suspension rates either as a reported indicator or as an accountability indicator, something to look at and evaluate, and then student attendance. So these are the kinds of things that will be in your conversations in the future, thinking about what should be reported, how you want it to be reported, what goes on a dashboard that people can look at regularly and use for diagnostics. And then the state can also give local districts support to use certain kinds of tools or indicators. Right now, the state has a pilot going for school climate surveys. And that might be something that, if it works out well, decide to do that statewide. And some states are bringing that then into accountability. There are measures of school integration the state is looking at developing. You could include measures of parent and community involvement and engagement. You could support districts with performance assessment tools and so on. So the state can think about its role not only around federal accountability, but also about what else it wants to report and what else it wants to support in terms of what happens in the districts. One last point, and then we're going to stop for comments and questions, is the academic standards and assessments. I want to congratulate you on the new standards, which are very exciting, and a lot of really important improvements that New Yorkers have made, I think, in that context. So those have just been completed. The next generation science standards have been adopted, and they begin to take effect this year. And so in terms of ESSA, looking forward, the new standards that you've just adopted will guide your next generation assessments, obviously. So there'll be a process that you'll be engaging in over the next couple of years to figure out exactly what those new assessments look like. The current and the future test items are developed and reviewed by teachers. The state is a leader in offering the assessments in multiple languages, 5 of them for the elementary assessments, representing 85% of English learners in the state. The goals for the next round include ensuring that the assessments provide accurate information, reducing testing time, developing new approaches, which may include some performance-based approaches, and applying for an innovative assessment pilot. So this is all TBD, to be done, because we don't want the staff to get complacent.
Oh, right. I think we've taken care of that.
And I'm going to then just take a moment for comments and questions about this section before we move into the discussion that Scott will lead on the accountability.
Okay,
system.
just, sorry, yeah. By the way, in terms of the staff, I looked at Beth Berlin and I said, when you made that comment, I said, oh, boy. I do also want to thank Beth because she's just been totally amazing. In terms of just a point of clarification, our standards, which we're going to spend time tomorrow, are the next generation of New York State learning standards. We're not calling them new because, in fact, we did rely on the law standards, which was a tremendous amount of work that Joan was able to dig up, and many of the people sitting around this table submitted as a look. Let's take a look at, because these law standards, and I think in this whole group, I think I'm the only one left standing from the law standards committee. But that and looking at the Common Core standards have created the next generation of New York State learning standards, which is how we are rolling out. So just for purposes of our conversation, these are going to be our next generation of New York State learning standards. Thank you.
Regent Cottrell, followed by Regent Kelly.
I wanted to point out that 3 of the Tier 2 indicators, school safety, suspension rates, and student attendance, are intimately tied to physical and mental well-being. And I think we can't talk about those without talking about the other, and for disabled students as well. So I think we really have to start to focus, because academic success equals physical and mental success. I think we really got to start to focus on that.
Very good point.
I'm thrilled to see civics. Checks and balances on power. Now, how important is that?
That was very subtle.
It will be.
I'm known for that.
It will be an exciting conversation for the regions to think about what a seal of civic engagement might actually include. So that will be fun, I think, and important.
Well, as long as we're out at Regent Cashman, we should probably mandate French for everybody. I just...
C'est une bonne idée.
The comment I had was, really follow up on Regent Cottrell's. There's so much on Tier 2 that we talked about state accountability and our responsibility. And so much of that is getting that data and reporting it back so that we can require districts to have certain parameters and certain standards, which we can't do because we don't have a lot of the data. But I would urge us to set that timeline for as quick as we can, because so much of Tier 2 really affects Tier 1. And I know we can't put them there now, but if we could, I'd like to put them there now. So I don't know what our timeline is, but we can't let this go on for a period of years without really incorporating that into Tier 1.
Regent Reyes?
Yes, speaking of political, it seems to me there needs to be a clear statement in this section about the costs, the resources, federal and state, that are indispensable for this, meaning that it's not about just having lofty goals, missions, visions, and indicators, but no means to implement them. And so I think our statement has to be very clear that resource accountability is not just ours in schools, but the state and the federal government. Because we're giving our plan, and we're saying we can't do more with less.
And funding is going to play a big part in moving forward with some of the concerns we've identified in Tier 2. As Regent Tillis just mentioned. And I do think it's important that throughout this process, we continue to keep in mind what is in Tier 2 and not lose sight of that after we submit our plan to ESSA in September. Regent Johnson.
I think this may be covered, but I want us to be a little bit more explicit in terms of early learning. I think it's time for us to acknowledge that kindergarten is an essential grade for students, since our standards, our next generation of standards, are K through 12, yet we don't mandate kindergarten, and there are still students who are not in full-day kindergarten, and we all know the research on brain development, so I'd like to suggest that at some point we introduce the notion of full-day kindergarten for all of our children. It seems kind of odd that we have full-day pre-K, but we don't have full-day kindergarten. So let me introduce that as something to think about next.
But it's not.
Thank you. Regent Reyes touched a little bit on what I was concerned about. We all discuss frequently unfunded mandates. And what we're doing here is setting a standard and saying, look for alternative uses of your resources. Well, many schools are doing just fine and are creative. There are many schools that don't have the resources at hand. I am also concerned about the relationship between Tier 1 and Tier 2. I like to keep a lot of things within the state so that we really have control over what we're asking people to do, and we can help decide where our wonderful congressional funds go. And I don't know whether we want to transfer that authority or power to the feds, whether or not we want to look at it on the state level. I am not a finance expert, and I look to all of you who have good, strong financial backgrounds to look at alternative resources and how we can keep the control local, meaning statewide. Because regardless who our president is or will be, we need to have control over education in New York State. Thank you.
Regent Finn.
I would just like to consider, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I would just like to consider the other side of what Regent Reyes and Mittler said, and that is to count up the cost if we don't get it right.
Oh, what that's true.
Okay, so, and a lot of times, you know, I remember I keep on my phone something I read about poverty and what it costs us to our economy, gross domestic product. So let's count up that side of the cost.
Good.
And we may even want to outline and let people know what it'll cost us if we don't get this right.
Regent Young will have the last question or comment at this point, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, this is just a recommendation, Commissioner. Perhaps someone could, as we are talking, create a list. So, for example, there is a compulsory education law in the state of New York, and if we are going to entertain modifying that, seems to me that's a legislative request. And so everything that we talk about may not necessarily fit into the plan. However, it may inform our work going forward. And so if someone is keeping a list of those items, then we can be sure to track them as we develop the legislative requests.
And on that point, I think it's important to keep in mind that just because something falls into Tier 1, Tier 2, doesn't indicate less value or concern or importance. A lot of the things that we have deemed to be of most importance over the last year or two, and even the more recent time leading up to this, would suggest that there are a lot of things that are not in Tier 1 that we deem to be of utmost importance.
I just want to say that we have 3 regions that are not here today, but they are actually watching and listening. So one of them has asked if you can speak into the mic so that they can hear. We have, one person who's at a conference, one person who's not feeling well, and the other person who, she's fine. She had a car accident the day before, but she's absolutely fine. So, but I want you to know they're all participating in the process. So, thank you. So if you could just speak into the mics, that's helpful.
All right, I'm going to ask that we move into goals at this point.
This is on. Okay. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. So I just want to talk about one point before we move into the goals, because we've had this rich discussion about all the potential indicators in Tier 2 and Tier 3, and I'm going to be the bad guy who's going to focus us on the Tier 1 indicators that we need to make some decisions about in order to submit the federal plan. But I do want to, it's a little bit of a problem in that we always think that 1 is better than 2 is better than 3. And so these tiers would be better off having different labels. And it doesn't mean that something that's Tier 2 is less important than Tier 1. But it's really, in terms of a theory of action, the Tier 1 indicators are the outcomes: student graduation, college preparedness, workforce preparedness, things like that. The other indicators that we're talking about collecting and reporting, some of them are outcomes in and of themselves, and many of them are along the way indicators, right? It's hard for kids to learn if they don't feel safe in school, right? As opposed to an outcome in and of itself. And so the other reason why we shouldn't rush to jump those into Tier 1 or accountability is because different schools and districts will have different contexts and different local theories of action for how they will use these various indicators. And we should be thoughtful about the implied causation, that just because we have that everybody has to do well on indicator X means that they're going to do well on outcome Y. And it might not be the case locally. So we need to empower locals to be able to use these data that we present. We should be very thoughtful about the data that we collect and present and how we present it, so people are able to use that to actually improve on these ultimate outcomes that people care about: student growth and student attainment and things like that. So that's my acknowledgement that those are really important, and there's a lot of work that needs to go into these, and it's really the way the reporting system and the utility, how these things get used, is really the holy grail of all this stuff. It's one thing to collect it and report it, but if nobody uses it to do anything, then we've just gone through a fool's errand. So that's really the goal that we'll be working through, and that's my sort of apology to move us into the nitty-gritty stuff that we have to work on. So one of the requirements for that'd be great, actually, for ESSA is that we have to establish long-term goals and what they call measures of interim progress. So occasionally you'll see the abbreviation MIP, measures of interim progress, and these long-term goals. And there's a fascinating array of goal setting going on around the country, from things that are 2040, 2050, and some of those seem to me like we're just hoping we're retired by the time this comes to fruition, to what I would consider the more reasonable kinds of goals that you actually might have a chance of attaining. And it was actually, it was my advisor, Bob Lynn, wrote this paper in 2003. It was actually the American Educational Research Association presidential address, where he talked about this notion of ambitious and reasonable goals. And he had this famous, actually Linda used it at a presentation a couple of weeks ago, this famous graph of showing, 100% proficient was the goal for NCLB in 2014. And he looked at NAEP data, and the trends were going like this. And for us to reach that goal, we would have had to, like take off on a rocket ship. And so now Bob said that, and he also gave some guidance of thinking about what would be a goal that could be attainable. So maybe if we look at the performance of the 65th or 75th percentile school now, we know that 25 or 35% of the schools are already meeting that. And if we set that as a goal, we know it's at least in the realm of possibility, where something like 100% proficient, people might question whether or not that was in the realm of possibility. So No Child Left Behind met the ambitiousness criterion. Many people would question whether or not it met the reasonableness criterion. The other thing, too, is that, and I give Ira a lot of credit for this, and we've been working on this with lots of other states, is to think about things change pretty rapidly. So as much as we want to change, keep things stable, we know that with politics and different agendas, things change. And so why would we want to set a goal that's, a measurable goal that's 15 years or 20 years out? It's good to have aspirations. But the reality, and I think it was Regent Johnson asked about how do we hold ourselves accountable as a state agency, as regents, is by keeping things that we can't kick down the road so easily. So setting goals that are in the realm of 5 or 6 years out, something that most of you will still be around the table within that time frame. And so then we can hold ourselves accountable, not just pass it off to the next. And so we are dealing with these various trade-offs, and we talk about aspirational and reasonable. And so one of the approach that we took, go to the next slide, sorry. I changed it on my screen, but I have to remember that. So we established this, what we call an ambitious, or we call it an end goal. We had a lot of different labels for it. This end goal of really where we want to get, and that is a more aspirational goal. But then from that, the real goal that we're using for ESSA, the long-term goals, we're calling this the first long-term goal, and that's a goal that's in the neighborhood of 5 or 6 years out from when the accountability system becomes operational. And from that point on, then we establish these measures of interim progress, or these annual targets of where we want to get. And we've done this in a variety of ways. We're going to go through and for each of the various indicators and talk about how we do this. Let's go to the next. And so we have these long-term goals and measures of interim progress. And the important thing to keep in mind is that we have these for the state as a whole, but then for each school and subgroup has their own measures of interim progress and goals. Because if they're far behind, they need a steeper trajectory or if they're already met the goal, then they have a more shallow trajectory. And so that's you'll see this. I'm not going to go through all this in great detail right now, but we'll talk about this because we use both these statewide goals and these more local goals in a way that we award points, if you will, in the accountability system. So just remember, there's these state that are the same for everybody, and that's like a common standard. And then there are these measures of interim progress that differ for each of the various subgroups and schools. So let's look at achievement. And so if we look at achievement, so if you remember, Linda mentioned the index system, which is really an important thing here, is for a number of reasons. Because NCLB focused simply on getting kids across that level 2 to 3 threshold. And there was this well-documented bubble kids phenomenon where schools put a lot of attention on those kids. That's where your money was, right? It was right at those kids who were just below proficient and get them over the bar. And that's where you could get the biggest gain for your dollars. And so what the index system does wisely is that it gives as many points for schools, for kids moving from level 1 to level 2 as it does from level 2 to level 3. And that's an important move, right? Because you're not going to get to level 2 until you actually work your way up if you're starting very low. And it also incentivizes schools for excellence and gives essentially half the amount of points, another 50 points in this case, going from level 3 to level 4. You could make the case that why don't you make it 300 points? There is this concern in the law about overcompensating. You don't want to mask kids who are falling below by kids who are doing well. And so New York has struck a nice compromise. And so in this case, the end goal would be an index score of 200. And if you look at that, you say, well, that means on average that everybody's proficient. Doesn't mean that every kid is proficient, but on average, everybody in the school would be proficient. And then from there, we work back and figure out what's an appropriate 5-year goal, which would be for the year ending 2022, because the system really kicks in 2017. And then each interim, because it's a 5-year goal, this is where We're not using higher math. It's just simply 20% of that in each of the 5 years. So if our goal, I don't have the statewide goals right in front of me. We'll show them shortly. You have that offhand? You probably do. For the achievement, the statewide 5-year.
Well, it would
Yeah.
depend on which group we're talking about.
These are all students.
Yeah, it's not there.
200 is the long term. We'll get it. So anyway, we'll give you that. But it gave you context of that. And because this is
Yeah.
where we are now.
Yeah.
Let's go to graduation right in the meantime. Okay. So for,
I've got it.
All right.
For all students for English language arts, it would be currently our performance index would be a 91, which means on average most of the students aren't even yet at level 3. And the goal would be to get to 112 towards that progression ultimately to 200.
It's in the facing document, page
Yeah.
23.
Thank you, Chancellor.
I think that's, if everybody
Yeah, 20.
just turns to that.
so you could see,
Yeah.
it would be almost equivalent to the No Child Left Behind to say that we're going to hold everybody accountable and get to 200. So we're saying 200 is our aspirational goal.
Yeah.
And what would be a reasonable target to get there in 5 years to keep us on that trajectory? Chancellor.
Yeah, just, it's, besides the fact that it's page 23, it's also the idea that that particular group of students were already at 91, which really, there was a lot of discussion around this issue of, deciding that all means all, that we were really looking to push all students. And also, I want to say that we have a glossary, because I know a lot of terms are being used. There is a glossary that supports the various acronyms and terms, because as Regent Finn always says, in education we have our own languages in other professions, so it's always important to make sure that we spell these out so that these documents become living and breathing documents for all.
Thank you, Chancellor. So, and people might say, well, we're at 91 and going to 112, 113 for ELA. That doesn't sound like that much, but when you actually look at historical performance, it's an acceleration of historical performance. And so, while people might want, we all want things to change more rapidly, but and the kind of wraparound services that some of the regions were talking about, those are all important things to consider and to actually try to move the system, because to shift from where we have been in historical performance to a rapidly accelerating performance means doing some things that are quite different in the system. So if we look at graduation rate, so the end goal for 4-year graduation rate, the aspirational goal is 95% of students graduate in 4 years. So then the 5-year goal is the distance from where we are now. 20% of that is the 5-year goal, between that and 95, and then we break that out further. So it's a lot of dividing by fives in this system. Actually, it'd be great. I refuse to go with the all students.
I think that one I'm pretty sure we're at 82% currently.
Right, I remember that actually. The 4-year graduation rate now is 82%. Our long-term goal is to get, again, an average of 95%. That's quite high and be important. And so then the 5-year goal is 20% of the distance between 82 and 95. Again, this is for the all students group.
That would be 85%.
85%. You think in 5 years, moving a graduation rate from 82 to 80, because 82 is pretty good already. 82 to 85, you think, well, that's only 3 points. Anybody who plays golf knows that to go from shooting 125 to 120, not so hard. To go from shooting 85 to 80, that's hard. And so this is in some ways like that. So moving from 82 to 85 it would be a big step. And it's a steeper trajectory that we're asking for those who are further behind, for those who are not at 82 right now. Doesn't mean they have to catch up to 85, but they have to, the acceleration means that that gap has to close.
No, the 4-year.
So let's go to English language proficiency. As Linda mentioned, English language proficiency is a new indicator for Title I accountability. It was formerly part of Title III accountability. And as part of this, it's we have less experience with it, to be frank, about holding schools and students accountable for this progress. And so we want students to make, and the language of the law doesn't talk about it as a status indicator. In other words, how many kids are English language proficient today? It's how many kids are making progress towards English language proficiency. There are various schools of thought of how long it should take students to become English language proficient from the time they enter. And we all know there's many contextual factors. The degree of academic language they had in their home language, the age at which they enter school here, the various other sorts of experiences they've had. And so this is one that's is a tricky indicator, to be blunt. But the goal is that the end goal is that we want 95% of students to be making progress towards English language proficiency in 5 or 6 years. We went back and forth. Is it 5?
It's 3 to 5.
3 to 5 years. So, so you'll see me ask Ira certain things. As the chancellor said, we've been iterating these things by the minute. We've actually started putting not just date stamps on our various documents, but time stamps as well, so that we day because
But we did
too many iterations.
Yeah,
every day.
Scott, we did consider, just so everybody knows, because of all the research, everybody sitting in the audience and everybody listening, we know that the research and says, in terms of language acquisition, the research that's been done by people like Jim Cummings and others have looked at the 5 to 7. But in reality, I also know that, Linda, you had some conversations with, we were looking at all the research, but in particular, you had some conversations around not comparing what other states, but also what some of the experts that are really doing some field work right now. And I think the number 5 kept popping up as the, so Kenji Yehuda.
Kenji Hakuda.
Yeah. Hakuda
5 or
was
6, right?
one of the people that we leaned on. So this was done through looking at research and looking at the experts as well.
And that's actually a good point, Chancellor, in general, is one of the things, and I think it was either the Commissioner or the Chancellor mentioned this, this is trying to get something out into the field and as a concept plan. Some of these numbers that we're talking about could change depending on how, when we look at the results of modeling the full system with actual New York State data, if we find that's not how we thought it was going to work, it will come back to the Regents with some, hopefully, tweaks and not changes. But some of the numbers that you might see here might require certain little tweaks depending on what we find from the modeling. So this is based on the same concept. The English language proficiency indicator has this 95% of students will be making progress, not be proficient, but making progress towards proficiency in 3 to 5 years. Is that right? I said that right. Yes, right. And so then the 5-year be proficient towards in 5 years, and so the 5-year goal for that is the distance from where we are now, which I believe is 41%.
I think it's now 49, I think, when
40.
we ran the base.
Okay, so 49%. So the distance between 49 and 95 divided by 5, so basically 45 or 46 divided by 5 becomes the 5-year goal is 49 plus 9 or something like that, right? And so that's, and then the interim progress for each year is then 20% of that distance, or about 2% more each year. Seems
Right.
doable when you talk about it like that.
I think this, Scott, I'm not going to cut you off, but before we move into indicator performance levels, I think this might be a good
Exactly.
opportunity for some questions or comment from anyone up to this point. And I believe Regent Tillett had a comment.
Yeah, I'm still confused by the difference between the growth and the performance, the proficiency indicators. We are, if by using the proficiency indicator, 2% a year or whatever it is, it's really more than that, as opposed to the growth indicator, which you were just talking about a little bit. I'm not sure where we want to go. I do believe that we need to look at it on a very periodic basis, 1 year at a time, because some of these things take a little time for a district to gear up, so that the first couple of years are going to be slower, I would think, than the last 3 or 4 years, or maybe after 2 years we should have a 5-year plan or something to that effect, because it does take time, especially for graduation rates and other things, for districts to do that. And I'm concerned that we're outweighing the growth by having the proficiency count so much on the accountability measures. And I just don't know where we're going with this, because I do believe the growth measures are good and that we should keep moving them up, but that doesn't mean that the proficiency measures are going to equal the goals that we're looking at.
So I think you'll be pleased when you see how we're putting together this, as you call it, proficiency and progress in a table, and those are coming up shortly. But the idea of actually looking at these increases over time is essentially a progress. It's an expectation of progress as opposed to just rewarding any progress. But the way that we have put them together allows the school to demonstrate progress in a number of different ways. So you'll see that very shortly, and hopefully that'll ameliorate some of your concerns.
Regent Young?
I'm certain you discussed this in your group. However, if you go back to slide 27 and 28, and you talk about the end game or the end goal of 200, and you said we're at 91 and you're going to 112, et cetera. So I guess the question that I have is how do you account for the various populations in New York State? So when we look at data, we disaggregate the data. I would imagine there are lots of students that are already at 200.
Yes.
And so the challenge for the state is not those students, it is the students who are furthest behind. And so when you say average, it's not clear to me how you accommodate those groups. And so I would just like to know what you discussed relative to that.
You're right. We discussed this a lot, and had a lot of people weighing in on this. So the way that we were able to do this is that the end goal of an index of 200 is the same for all subgroups of students. So the various 9 subgroups by which we break it out. And let me just finish this, but then we look at from where they are now and the distance between where they are now to 200, and we use that to establish the 5-year goal. So the 5-year goal is not the same for every subgroup of students in the state, but for many subgroups, that represents a considerable acceleration towards closing the gap over time.
So just so I'm clear, this application would actually state what the 5-year goal would be
For
each-
every
for
single
each
subgroup,
group.
for every grade span, for every subject.
So it wouldn't necessarily be 112.
No, that was just, I didn't want to give
Okay,
you all
okay.
9 of them.
All right, fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Regent Johnson.
I want to build on the question that was just raised by Regent Young and ask you whether you recognized that reaching that end goal needs to be defined by effort, and how does effort get considered in all of this, because we're looking at such a diverse group of students across the state. That's number one, but I think I'm really interested in what research findings, what evidence do you have that this algorithm you're using to get to the end goal is one that's authentic?
That's a good question, Regent Johnson. So the first part of, in terms of the effort, the effort is we're only able to see it in terms of the progress that they're making. And you'll see again, as I mentioned earlier, in the way that we're characterizing progress in multiple ways towards their local goals as well as towards state goals, and that's coming up, is a way to try to recognize progress in multiple forms. In terms of the actual effort that's put in, we don't think that we could see that, to be blunt about it. It's not like a teacher who will reward a kid who works really hard and persists on a math problem but still gets it wrong. We're not able to do that from the state level, but we are able to recognize the progress that the schools make towards that goal, as I said, in various forms. So it's not just a single bar kinds of thing. So that's one way to try to operationalize this notion of effort. In terms of the research basis, to be frank, there isn't a lot of research basis around setting goals. We have some guidance, and we have actually modeled this. So in terms of empirical research, we've actually modeled this with using simulations and things like that. And if we establish targets that are in the range of where, let's say, a 60th or 65th percentile school is performing now, that means that it is doable for all schools, we hope. And if we saw that kind of progress, it still is an acceleration over the historical rates of progress. It's not such an acceleration that we put it into the realm of impossibility, but it's an acceleration that does try to get at this notion of closing gaps over time.
My concern is that this will look like the NCLB data. The schools that are low performing will still be low performing on this scale, and the schools that are high performing will still be high performing. And what we want to try to do is acknowledge the fact that we want all of our schools to improve, but there's nothing worse than being shamed at being identified as the lowest performing schools. And that's what we're doing here. And I thought we were going to try to get away from that and focus more on continuous improvement, as opposed to you are the 10% or 5% lowest performing schools, without acknowledging what it takes. And I recognize that we have schools that are low performing compared to high wealth schools, but the effort that it takes is somehow not identified here, and you said you can't do that. So I don't know how we do this, but
Well, Regent Johnson, I do think that where this is noticeably different than the accountability systems that came before it, it has, as Linda mentioned, we have student growth, student longitudinal growth. How much progress do students make from year 1 to year 2? And then we have school progress, which how did the school perform this year compared to last year? And you'll see in this identification that growth, in terms of identifying schools that need comprehensive or targeted support, student longitudinal growth counts as much as academic achievement. So in terms of, like I said, I can't see the effort, but if we see growth, that's the kind of school that we want to say is doing the best they can with what they have, and they're moving kids in the right direction.
so is that to come?
That's to come.
Okay, got it.
All right, I want to move on. I'm going to allow for 3 more questions here, and then I really want to get into performance level indicators. Regent Cottrell.
Yeah, I just
I
wanted,
also ask that anyone asking a question be as as brief as you possibly can in stating your excellent question.
I just wanted to emphasize
Speak up and shut up is what he's saying.
what I think it's very important to emphasize what Regent Johnson and Regent Young have said about the progress. And if you look at the graduation rates, I can see in a high poverty area that you might get from 82 to 85, but I can't see getting to 95. So I think the metrics are a bit off, frankly. And has this worked somewhere else?
Well, that's a good question. We know that actually holding everybody to 95% right now hasn't worked. And these goals will be evaluated every 5 years. This has a continuous improvement approach built into it so that we could see if we didn't even make it from, again, the all students group, this is disaggregated for every subgroup, but if we didn't even make it from 82 to 85 in 5 years, let's say, then we have to reevaluate whether or not that 95 is an appropriate end goal. If things go well and we actually go from 82 to 87 for the all students, let's say, then it would actually say that, yeah, 95 is likely in the realm of possibility and we have to keep moving. But these are, again, these, if you look at the current distributions, these are in the realm of possibility, these 5-year goals. The 95% and these end goals are signals that we aspire more than just saying we're okay if 15% of the kids don't graduate. It's not, we don't want to say that. We want to say that our ultimate goal is to get to 95, but it's not fair to layer that on the schools right now without building in these measures that are more reasonable and achievable, and still an acceleration.
Regent Mittler.
I really am concerned about relying data's important, but relying so heavily on one set of numbers. And I don't know if you're doing your evaluation by individual, because there's a difference between progress and achievement.
I think you better move your mic.
And so, there's a difference between progress and achievement.
Yeah.
If we're looking for growth, that's not necessarily achievement. Are we doing it by individuals? Are we doing it by cohorts? Are we being proportional for students who move in and out? Very often our students where their English is a second language or sometimes a third are very transient, so your numbers go up and down. And a school can have an excellent program, but if someone comes in at level 1 and barely gets to level 2, moves out, you get new level 1, how do you look at your data and say this is fair, this is equitable? I just think that if there's failure to grow, we have to look at why. I mean, the components of this measure concern me, and you can lie with statistics. I read the book. And so I know we need the data, but I'm concerned about how we're doing it. I think we're putting low-income schools at a real disadvantage.
Let's just be very, very clear. As we have done a lot of work around this conversation, this has multiple ways. So that, let's just be clear that achievement is one aspect, growth is another. So we are collecting multiple pieces of information. It is not, I just don't want anybody to think that it's a single one aspect of looking at success. It's multiple ways, and that's been the ongoing conversation. If you go back to the document has really emphasized the fact that we are capturing different pieces of data to really create this composite, if you will. So it is really, truly, the document itself, whether it's the public facing or the full 187 pages that all of us have read, please know that it's got lots of different pieces that eventually become part of the coherence and the representation of what it means to be part of the success story, if you will. So it's really looking at multiple ways of analyzing different pieces of data. It's just not just achievement. So this really has various components. you know, when you say achievement, if you recall, that's one aspect. So you have progress, you have, so there are different pieces. But we also don't want to say that our kids, all kids, are able to achieve and cross the finish line and be successful. I just want to make sure that we all believe in our heart of hearts that this is for all children and that all kids can do this. I think if we start out with the premise that only some can do this, I think we are really, in many ways, holding back or making assumptions. So please let us know, let us make sure that through today's work and for the next 5 years, that we believe that our belief system guides us. And our belief system is about all kids can do this. Thank you.
All right, I wanna move on to performance level indicators. Regent Reyes, I'm gonna have you ask this last question, and then I would ask the presenters to move into performance level indicators.
Yes, thank you. In the long section about goals for ELA, math, and graduation, when looking at L's and others, the baseline of 37 ELA, 55 math, and then the graduation rate is so far below everybody else. The graduation rate, 45. Even at 6 years, it's 50. And so the 21-22 target of 59 seems reasonable, but the end goal of 97 is not aspirational, it's delusional. Unless there's a revolution. Unless there's a revolution in terms of opportunity to learn. Curriculum available, certified teachers available, class size programs, changes that aren't happening and are not funded. And so I'm concerned of being part of a process that looks like it's delivering a vision to all equally, but without any guarantees in the how do we get there to make it real. Meaning I could be here 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and we're talking about 67 instead of 57. But we're nowhere near 97. So I just hope somebody is clear about how urgent that is.
Well, I appreciate that. Remember, this, after today, what we're talking about will be rolled out to the public for public comment. We'll hear comments coming back to the public, and we'll have opportunity to discuss a lot of the concerns that we're putting on the table today. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask that we move on for the moment.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. So, a couple things. For Regent Reyes, we did bat around a lot of different labels for this end goal. Delusional never came up, but although we could see the point. But what we're going to do, since there's so many questions about some of these issues, we thought it might make sense. We're going to do a little flip around here, and we're going to move to slide 44 to help hopefully clarify some things, and then we'll come back to, if we have time, to the other slides about establishing the performance levels, because we think this gets at this. So this is about how we're identifying schools, because under the law, there's two main requirements for identification. We have to identify schools for comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement. And they have different rules associated with different ramifications associated with them. And so that's all that's required in terms of establishing some outcome levels as a result of this. There's New York is choosing to do some additional things we'll talk about. But so if we move to slide 45, there's what's that?
46.
46.
Oh, somehow
You're behind.
I'm one behind. It's pretty typical. Actually, speaking of behind, I could top Linda's 25 years ago she was doing this. I won't say how many more years than that, but I was at this time of year studying for the Regents exams at my parents' house. So a little more than 25, unfortunately. And so I was always a little behind. But it was so the lowest, there's types of schools that we have for identification for comprehensive support and improvement. And I know those of you television crime drama fans, see CSI and you think it's some crime scene investigation. It's not. And so we have low performing schools, or lowest performing schools, and this is the lowest 5% of schools, lowest performing 5% of schools. Don't anybody jump on this yet. I'm going to define what that means in a second. Anticipate. And that has to be done at least once every 3 years, and the initial year would be 18-19. The low graduation rates, so all public high schools in the state with graduation rate, 4-year adjusted graduation rates of less than 2/3 of the students, 67%, would be identified as a comprehensive support and intervention school. And then we have what's called chronically low performing subgroups. And you're going to see some various terms in here that will make your head spin. There's consistently underperforming subgroups we're going to talk about later. But these are chronically low performing subgroups. And so these schools would have first been identified under the targeted support and improvement for having a low performing subgroup, and did not improve enough to exit that status. And after that period of time, they would be deemed to be chronically low performing.
Scott, could I just
yes,
interject
please.
that on the graduation rate, the 4-year is initially used, but then we do use the 5 and 6-year graduation rate also in making that determination about the schools that have to be identified based on the 67%.
Right. Thank you, Ira. And so those are the types of schools that can be identified for comprehensive support. So we're going to talk first about the low-performing schools. And so what you see here is I had a lot of words on the page the last time. Linda said, use pictures. So you can see I was...
He's very proud of these pictures. Give him a little positive reinforcement.
Thank you. That's right. I was a math science guy. But you see this continuum of achievement on, let's say, on the achievement index. And then we identify the schools who are the lowest 10% of schools on the achievement index. So that's getting at Regent Johnson's worry right directly, that are we identifying the same schools? But then we look at growth. This is for elementary and middles. This is student longitudinal growth. And this is how much the kids grow, each individual kid, from 3rd grade to 4th grade, 4th grade to 5th grade, 5th grade to 6th grade, and so on. How much do those kids grow? What's the average growth for the school? And because that measure tends to be a little unstable, we take a 3-year average of that. So it's the average growth for that school over a 3-year period for the kids in that school. Okay. And so we identify the lowest 10% of schools there, and we've called that level 1 on those indicators because that's a flag. And then we actually combine them, and we basically add the rankings, if you will, and we look at the lowest 10% of schools on achievement and growth together. And so they're equally weighted in that determination, achievement and growth. And we think that that's a troublesome scenario if the school is both low achieving and the kids aren't making growth. We see lots of cases where we have schools where the kids have low achievement rates, but they're making exemplary growth. We see schools where there's actually high achievement and they're not making much growth. Those schools will still likely not be identified. Now, you're probably saying, wait, you just said 5% of schools. Why you have a red marker there for 10%? As you're going to see, this is the initial pool, if you will, the initial catchment area of schools. And then we will look at other indicators, as I'm going to show you right on the next slide, to see if the schools are making progress or showing strength in other areas as a way to exit them out of potential identification. And so you see there, we have, again, this is elementary middle. We have achievement and growth, and we have this combined indicator. And then we have progress. Remember, progress is different than growth, but related. It's how much has the school improved on its index score from 2016 to 2017 to 2018, right? So there's different kids in that, whereas the growth is each individual kid. How are they doing on progress? How are they doing on English language proficiency? And how are they doing on chronic absenteeism? Again, just focusing on elementary middle. And so if they're if they're the lowest level on achievement and the lowest level on growth and the lowest level on the combined indicator, they're automatically. Now, if remember, the catchment area is the level 1 or the lowest 10% on the combined indicator. But we still could likely have cases where they're a level 1, the lowest 10% on achievement, but they're not the lowest on growth, but somehow the combination puts them in as a level 1. But we'll say, so they're actually making better than the lowest 10 percentile of growth. And we'll say, if they have a level 1 on any of these other 3 indicators, either progress is low, their English language proficiency performance is low, or the chronic absenteeism is very low, level 1 low, and you'll see level 1, it's hard to get to. If they're low on any of those, then they would be identified for comprehensive support and improvement and intervention. Similarly, if they are low on growth, but not in the lowest 10 percentile of achievement, and they're still their combined indicator, right? They wouldn't even be on this page if the combined indicator wasn't 1. Then they need 2 of the other 3 indicators to be level 1. In this case, this is a little valuing of achievement, a little bit more, tiny bit more than growth. We're saying that if any 2 of those, either progress in ELP or ELP and absenteeism, are level 1, then they would be identified for comprehensive support and intervention. Let me, Vice Chancellor, let me just pause, because that was a lot, and it's really important before we move to high schools. Let me see if there's questions.
All right.
All right. Okay. So remember, at the high school level, we don't have student longitudinal growth because we test the kids in 8th grade, and then they might take an algebra Regents. Many of them take it in middle school, and a geometry Regents some point. English language arts, they take it in 11th grade, right? And so people have said, well, we could do growth from 8th grade to 11th grade. We could make the numbers come out of the computer, but what they mean is a lot of times a mystery. It's which kids were in, which kids were out, what happened in those intervening years, so the attribution is very difficult. So growth is not part of the high school model. And so, but the 2, we would argue, the 2 most critical indicators are graduation from high school and achievement. So this follows the same model as the elementary middle, but instead of student academic growth, it's looking at graduation. Now, this does put more emphasis on achievement and attainment versus growth. People say, is that fair? And there's a question that high school really does need to be about attainment because you're running out of time. And so this was the decision of various groups to recommend that achievement and growth be combined. And let me just show you, I see Regent has a question, but let me just show you on the next, and similarly, we have progress in there, and ELP, and then we have the career and civic readiness, and we also have chronic absenteeism. And again, so if you're low, the lowest level on achievement, the lowest level on graduation, and actually where the cut is on graduation, you would automatically be identified, right? Isn't that right, Ira? Is that a different pool?
Well, in the high school system, because of the additional rule that we have to identify schools that have graduation rates under 67%, most of the schools that will be identified in the bottom 5% will also be schools that would have been identified anyway because they also have graduation rates below 67%. even when we look at it over a 6-year period.
So, so in this case, it runs analogous to the elementary middle system, whereas if you're really low on graduation and achievement and you're low on the combined, you're automatically identified. And then if you are low on achievement but not the lowest on graduation and you're still low on the combined, then you need 2 of the other 4 indicators to be level 1. And this is the part we skipped over, but we thought this was important. We'll go back to how we're establishing those levels. Low on progress or ELP or college career readiness or chronic absenteeism. So I see there's some questions
Yes,
here.
before we move in to that next presentation, there were a couple of questions, Regent Tillis and Regent Cash.
These indicators, achievement, graduation, are fixed in our minds as of right this minute. We are looking at new assessments. We're looking at performance-based. We're looking at adaptive. We're looking at a variety of things that will happen probably in the next 2 to 3 or 4 years. Graduation rates in the last year, we have changed our graduation formula in the area of special ed students, in the area of 4+1, and I don't think we're done yet, sometime in the next a few years. It's as if we're shoveling mercury with a pitchfork. We're saying these are fixed things to identify schools, and then we're changing the landscape of what it is that we're identifying. And I'm concerned that it sounds good, but as we shift, as we change things, these things probably should change also. And I don't know what kind of review we're going to have on a very periodic basis, since we are moving fairly rapidly on some of these things.
So that's a great point. And, you know, there is this axiom in our field, Al Beaton, say if you want to measure change, don't change the measure. And so, but on the other hand, just like the how to lie with statistics was mentioned, we have another saying in our office, algebra is our friend. And so we actually do know how to, we actually have a ton of experience at helping states transition across these assessment changes and how to do this. And so that's something. Now, the challenge there is where we have to be careful as opposed to just letting throwing things into the computer and let it come out. There's one thing to say that we know how to just translate, because the assessments will be highly correlated, even no matter what we do. They will be correlated with one another. And we can evaluate that, and then we can actually build in to the transition, to the crosswalk, the amount of progress we have observed, or things like that. So there's ways to do this numerically. We have to be careful. So I'm not advocating for changing things every year, because it's disruptive to the system and hard for people to make progress. But there are ways to transition across and to put in some, I don't want to use safe harbor, but some wind at your back kinds of provisions that allow folks to have a different chance of showing that they would have done okay. So we have a lot of experience with this. Linda reminded me, and this is right, and again, one of the things that our office is going to be doing along with Ira's group over the as this goes out for comment in the next few months, is doing a lot of modeling of the system and these various things that we talked about. So before long, you'll be actually able to see real numbers and see the percent of schools who would be in various categories depending on the types of schools. So you'll be able to see a lot of that stuff. As to modeling and assessment transition, that's a little harder, but that's something we can actually do, build into the next assessment RFP and when that comes. Let's Commissioner.
Yeah, but I think it's important to understand, you're talking about the high school right now. So we aren't talking about our
Right.
3-8 assessments. We're talking about Regents exams, which forever, Regents exams, over a period of time, we change questions on them. We verify that they're at the same level of rigor, et cetera. And so those are all things that are identified. When you look at graduation options that we have, the 4+1, other things that we're adding, those are all things that really get to, if you you remember the other points that are critically part of this system, which is making available opportunities for students to learn. All of those things open up additional opportunities for students to get graduation credentials. And those are things that when you're talking about the high school, I think we have less of an issue with that very point that you're bringing up, Regent Tillis, than we do in other areas, because these are things that we're moving to change in graduation options and opportunities, but it's consistent across the entire state. And we're using assessments that have been reviewed for instance, the CTE certification, external assessments that come and are used across the nation. So I think from the high school perspective, what we've done is open up ways that we can look at what's happening in the high school to give opportunities and options for all students. And we want to make sure we measure that well, and we let schools know you're doing a good job with that, or you really are not compared to other school districts and schools.
If we keep college and career ready as the exact same as we have now, and not change it to include civic and other things that we were talking about, which are going to change graduation rate, I would think.
Well, we would hope. Why would we do it if we weren't trying to really encourage students in multiple ways to have access to that diploma?
All right, we're going to have 3 more questions, and then, Scott, I'm going to ask you to move on.
Sure.
After that. Regent Cashin, Regent Young, Regent Owen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just quickly, as I look at the chart, which one of these dimensions is the cornerstone upon which achievement occurs, growth occurs? It's attendance. So I don't know, when I look at it, I almost want to see attendance emphasized, because you can't get graduation, you can't get achievement, you can't get growth without it. And the first thing, if you were a superintendent or a principal, the first thing you focus on is not getting the scores up, attendance.
It's there.
So,
Chronic absenteeism.
no,
right?
yeah, right. So what I'm just saying is I don't know if this, the way it's conveyed, if you can modify it to focus on attendance somehow, I don't know if you can, but I would like to see that. Secondly, what's on my mind also with the transfer high schools, with overage, undercredited students, were they going to be held to the same standard? Is there going to be a modification of this? Because we don't want kids, not graduating. They have so many circumstances that are against them. And if we get them into a transfer high school, how can we support them so they can graduate and get a diploma and get a job and have a life?
So I'm going to really go back to something that I heard the chancellor say a moment ago, that we've had conversations long and hard about. All means all. Okay, I think the transfer high schools are great opportunities for kids who need to have a different setting. But I think we can also say that if in our history of education that sometimes kids aren't going to be placed in a transfer high school for the reason that we think we can get you through. Very often we look at any of the schools, and we've got them not just our transfer high schools in New York City, but in other places, that are places where students who aren't seen as going to be making it in a regular high school are placed there. So we really want to work, and that's one of the reasons I think it's so powerful to have the 4, 5, and 6 graduation rates included in supporting schools to keep kids and to support them to be successful, and look carefully at who goes into the transfer high schools. And of course, the transfer high schools or the alternative schools or whatever they're called, they are all means all. And if you aren't going to have schools irresponsible for the students that are placed there, then we aren't saying all means all. And I think that's a very important thing. Now, does that require a lot of work? Yes. It requires looking very carefully at who is going into a school that's an alternative and what we can do to help them.
Commissioner, could I just add one thing numerically? We are counting the 4-, 5-, and 6-year
right.
graduation rates, and we're actually counting them very generously. So that is a way to recognize the effort those schools are putting forth.
So just to the last point, a lot of what we have, all of what we've heard this morning is essentially school focus, and I think my colleague Regent Johnson alluded to it. We also know historically that, at least in New York and perhaps nationally, but I know in New York, that most of these schools historically, since we've identified schools, have all been in the same districts. So that suggests something else. So that while we're required by law to do a school focus, I think I'm not certain that you've not covered it, so you may have talked about it, but without something that's more systemic, that addresses the capacity and the leadership and the commitment of districts on some of these issues, because the sad reality is that while we want all to mean all has never meant all. And so the issue, what I worry about is that while we maintain the school focus, there's got to be some mention, and you may have done this, that deals with a more pervasive and systemic issue, and that's the district focus. In other words, what the commissioner talked about is a function of a district policy.
That's right.
It's not the transfer school, it's the policy in the district. And so without looking at the policies of some of these places, each year we're starting over and over again with different schools, but they're always in the same location. So while I appreciate, and this is lots of work, and if it's not included, I think it's something that the board has to discuss, because I think that's a real issue for us to just focus on schools without looking at a more systemic approach in some of these places. And in particular, in the city that I live in, one of the huge challenges is that you've got high schools that operate separate from the K-8, and quite honestly, they're never represented in anything, right? And so the issue for us becomes, how do you manage that, and who do you actually hold accountable? And so it's hard for me to even understand how you all know the connection between managing transitions and student outcomes. And so when kids are leaving the 8th grade and they're going all over, and many times they're going to communities and organizations that don't know them, it's hard to imagine that they're going to consider the spirit of the all that we're talking about.
Right.
So Regent Young, we do, and we could talk more about this. There is district accountability. You're exactly right, first of all. But there are district accountability provisions. Doesn't mean it couldn't go further, that districts are identified as low performing if their portfolio of schools indicates that they have many schools in these various statuses of CSI or TSI. And then for the smaller districts, essentially, almost rolled up as if they were a big school. So there is this, but there could be more done, and that's a Regents policy.
Well, all I'm suggesting, and I don't want to take a lot of time with this, is even if you have one school, see, it just seems to me that we know that these schools are all in the same district, and they have been. They've been since Tom Sobel was the commissioner. And so Right? No. Since we've started identifying schools, these schools have been in the same districts. And so that suggests something else. And I think that as a body, while we're addressing the application because of the federal requirement, there's something else that has to happen to address the real issue. That's all I'm suggesting that maybe we could take on at a later date.
I just want to suggest we come back to this very important point when we get to the school improvement part of the discussion, because the state has a lot of levers that it can use when schools are identified, and it does take steps towards more district accountability, because the old NCLB was very focused on the school and less on the district, and that may be a place where you want to really consider how to make sure that districts are doing what they need to do to ensure the movement of the schools. So.
And that's a bigger point, because we often talk about what happens between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m., but often the real battleground is what happens from 3 p.m. to 8 a.m. And that is something that we have to continue to talk about as we go forward. Right now, Regent Norwood, I'm going to ask you to ask your question or make your comment, and then Scott, I really want to continue to move on.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Commissioner, I want to come back to your response to Regent Tillitz's comment and question. Really appreciating, and it's very clear, the value of having more measures and mixed measures at the high school level to allow us a deeper insight. What's not clear to me in reading through the plan and the strategy is whether or not we're seeing or thinking about the value of that to how we assess and interpret the performance of charter schools.
Well, I would say to you that if we are having our public schools, and remember charter schools are public schools, that these same characteristics and the same evaluation systems should certainly be part of that evaluation. Okay, I don't think that we have a separate system. I think we have charter schools that are established to support kids, and that should be the approach that we take. So much of this work and the comment that Regent Young made about how do we have districts understand, I think we have to use this opportunity to share all of this with the districts who are making decisions that are affecting schools, and with charter organizations and anyone who, the board of charter schools, so they understand these are the anticipated outcomes for students in New York State. And I think that should permeate all of the schools in New York State, and I think that's just the reality. It may be a change.
So
it may be a change.
To see a roadmap as we move through this work as planned, by which that becomes explicit in our charter school work and closes that intuitive gap. Because I think you're right. We should be treating public schools as public schools, and we should be treating all of the schools in USNE to reach the same standards by a common accountability rubric.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, Scott, I'm going to ask you to move on with TSI schools.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chancellor. So what we're going to do is we'll go through the targeted support and intervention schools. It should be very quick. And then we're going to, given the time, we're going to turn to Linda and some SED staff to talk about school improvement. And there'll be a little transition there so people could at least stand up and sit down and get some blood flowing. But no more than that. Otherwise, you got to get a hall pass. So let's targeted support and intervention schools. As I mentioned before, there are these two types of schools: consistently underperforming subgroups, and then low-performing or chronically low-performing subgroups. And the law defines these, so the consistently underperforming subgroups have to be identified annually. The other thing I should say, and this actually feeds into Regent Young's point that he was making about districts. We think of this identification as this is now something the state is responsible for. The state is ultimately responsible for. But the CSI schools, the comprehensive schools, are on a state list, and the state is required to spend resources and intervene as necessary. The TSI schools are district responsibility. The state assists with the identification, but then it's the district that's responsible for the developing the plans, the interventions. And so to Regent Young's point, some of the districts might need some support in doing that effectively and actually improving those schools. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's different than the NCLB mindset that a lot of people have. And so the low-performing subgroups, as we mentioned earlier, need to be identified once every 3 years. What we've done here is, and again, we've discussed this a lot, there's the potential to significantly over-identify schools with TSI. We don't, depending on how you read the law. Nobody knows what's the right number of schools to identify, but we do know that if subgroups are consistently behind and low performing, particularly relative to other subgroups in their state, then the schools probably need to be flagged. So every 3 years, New York will identify the lowest 5% of schools for each of the following subgroups, and we're going to do it in the ways that I just described to you for CSI identification. So it's the nice thing about it is people don't have to juggle different algorithms in their head to figure out how do I get identified for this, how do I get identified for this. We use the same approach, and we argue, and again, we will check this with the data modeling that will be coming forth, but we're going to use the same methodology that we use for CSI to identify, and we'll essentially repeat it for each of the subgroups you see listed on the screen. And so, does it mean we're going to have 45% of schools? If we're going 5%, there'll likely be some overlap, so it probably won't be. Then, if these schools that are identified do not improve after 3 years, if the subgroups in those schools do not improve after 3 years, they move into the next category of targeted support, into the chronically low performing. And that's it for TSI. We try to keep it as clean as possible. We try to make sure that we're identifying the schools where the subgroups need the most help. And we think that this actually gets at it in a pretty elegant fashion, I would actually argue. So, Commissioner or anyone else, Joan?
I think this may be a good point to take a 5-minute break.
Is there such a thing?
There is. Let's say 5 minutes does not mean 6 minutes.
Okay.
We are staying on schedule, and
Take a 4-minute break.
have time to complete our program this morning. So if we take a 5-minute break, that would work.
And then we're going to change the configuration of people at the table.
Very good. Okay,
Give us somebody else to look at.
I'm at the Regents site, but I can't get into my mail.
So what I
do is I
Google, I type into Chrome
like Outlook 365.
We
Okay,
didn't get
got it.
bogged down in-
Okay, you just go in the other way. Got it.
Yes, multilingual hyphenation.
Well,
We need that.
because
Hi.
I didn't do a lot of reading.
What's up?
Caught up with-
You were looking my way, baby.
I have to keep an eye on you.
I actually took notes.
All right, we are almost ready here.
Thank you for the break.
There we go.
They told me it was the electricity.
So we've been hearing all about the indicators and the accountability system, but this is the really important stuff, which is how do we actually help schools improve and support educators in doing their work and support English learners and other students across the state. And so the staff have been working very diligently on the plans to really invest in and support schools, and we're going to hear about that quickly now. I'm joined first by Stephen Early, who has been working on the plan for improving schools. I will kind of frame it, and he'll continue. Then Alex Tricolinos has been working on the educator quality and equity plans, and then Lisette Colon Collins will talk about the English learner and multiple language learner plans, and then we'll kind of conclude with the sort of a quick touch on all the other parts of what's in the long plan. And I know you've all read it carefully and slept with it under your pillow, and so you know you know how much is there. So on the plan for improving schools, sort of the big point to start with is that the state is really moving away from a one-size-fits-all to helping schools identify and implement specific solutions that are needed to address their specific challenges. There's a very thoughtful needs assessment process that will allow the identification of those challenges and solutions. The state plan will treat schools differently based on their needs and the extent of their gains over time, with more support and more oversight to those with the greatest needs and an increasing amount of support and oversight. Districts figure prominently in this, to the point that was made earlier. I would also urge you, if you have not had a chance to look at the long version of the plan, there's a lot of the detail about this in that long version, which really describes the way in which districts are also called to really support the schools. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Good morning. So I'll start today talking about our stakeholder engagement process, because that was very helpful in our development of the end plan, or the draft plan, if you will. During conversations with a variety of stakeholders throughout New York, the State Education Department repeatedly heard that intervention is a serious step that must be applied selectively to schools that are struggling to make gains. The department also heard from numerous stakeholders that it must remember that the struggles facing a school are often not the result of a lack of effort. Throughout the stakeholder engagement process, the State Education Department staff heard the need for interventions to be school-specific and connected to the needs assessment process. Stakeholders suggested that one-size-fits-all requirements can present additional challenges or may not be appropriate for the circumstances of the school, and therefore flexibility was necessary in order for districts and schools to identify the best solutions for their specific circumstances. This is consistent with recent shifts that the department has made to move from just monitoring for compliance to now also focusing on serving as a source for support, recommendations, and technical assistance. Stakeholders also shared that the challenges facing schools can be significant, and the department needs to ensure that sufficient supports are provided to schools to address these challenges. So our focus throughout this is the way that we're approaching this is focusing not on the schools as being low performing, but also recognizing that these are the schools that are in need of the most supports to catch up to their peers. So that's a subtle shift, but it's also recognizing that we have a responsibility as a state to help them get there. So through this, the way that we propose doing this is developing a system rooted in focusing on giving schools the support they need. And by doing this, the state education department will utilize its collective knowledge, its experience, its access to data, its ability to provide financial supports, its authority as an oversight entity to support the improvements necessary to increase student outcomes in struggling schools. So the state's role in school improvement will be rooted in helping schools identify and implement the specific solutions they need to address their specific challenges. This approach also allows the state to support schools differently based on the trajectory of the school and the length of time that it has been identified. So when we're looking at the big picture here, we're recognizing that in order to help schools identify and implement the solutions most appropriate to the school's needs, a robust needs assessment will serve as a foundation for school improvement. This process will examine the quality of the educational program, the use of resources, including time, people, and money, and school data on multiple indicators. Schools will develop annual improvement plans based on this needs assessment. Initially, NYSED will provide broad support for school improvement efforts to help all identified schools, specifically the CSI schools. In subsequent years, NYSED will focus its attention on the subset of schools that are not making gains so that those schools can receive extra attention and support to best support teaching and learning at the school. The state's efforts towards supporting identified schools involves 8 critical components, which are displayed on the screen. The state will help support these schools by supporting the comprehensive diagnostic needs assessment process, supporting the development and implementation of school-wide plans, supporting the implementation of evidence-based interventions and improvement strategies, providing training to districts on supporting schools, providing data to inform plans and call attention to inequities, connecting schools and districts with other schools, districts, and professionals, allocating and monitoring school improvement funds, providing additional support and oversight for schools that are not making progress. So you see, we're really approaching this through a supportive role rather than an intervention role. The state will provide ongoing support and guidance to identified schools and districts as they undertake a series of required actions designed to best promote improvement and identify and implement the solutions best suited for each school. Under this model, the TSI schools will be supported by the district, which will be responsible for conducting TSI needs assessments and approving and monitoring TSI school improvement plans. This will allow the state to focus its attention toward the CSI schools. The holistic needs assessment process that examines school systems, resources, and data is intended to help advance teaching and learning and address inequities within schools and districts. This process will allow schools to consider potential root causes so that improvement plans can strategically address areas of need while supporting areas of strength. NYSED will support schools through all stages of the improvement process, including the requirement that schools include an evidence-based intervention in their annual plan and provide professional development to support this plan. To further inform the improvement planning cycle, NYSED will support ways to collect other sources of feedback to schools, including having identified schools conduct annual surveys of parents, teachers, and staff, and promoting a parent voice in decision-making. The state will also promote equity through its plan by helping ensure that identified schools are positioned to be successful and calling attention to inequities so that they can be reduced. Identified districts will be required to explain in their annual plan how they are reducing and eliminating inequities within the district. And the state will also conduct annual cycles of resource reviews with identified districts that have multiple identified schools to determine the most appropriate actions to reduce and eliminate these inequities. To help position schools for success, comprehensive support and improvement schools will only be able to accept transfers from within the district if that teacher was rated effective or highly effective the previous year. In addition, the state's differentiated approach that intends to provide more support and attention to the schools that need it the most is intended to reduce the gaps that exist between schools. The draft plan that you all have been provided outlines the supportive role that the state will take in working with identified schools and districts. The state will approach school improvement as a set of strategies to be done in partnership with identified schools and districts, as opposed to approaching school improvement as a set of stages to be imposed on schools and districts. And I think that's an important shift that we recognize with the school improvement team, is that we see school improvement as a set of stages to be done in partnership with identified schools and districts, rather than a set of stages to impose on schools and districts. We will be doing this with you, not to you, and we will be here for support throughout the process.
So remarkably, we are a little bit ahead of schedule. And I'd just like to stop and see if there are comments and questions on this important part of the plan before we go to effective educators. I also would like to ask one. Could you say a little, in the long version of the plan, there's a nice discussion of the professional development networks and support systems that are available. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, New York is uniquely situated with the BOCES, where they're able to serve as a resource to districts that work with them to help promote professional development. There's also the regional technical assistance networks or external technical assistance networks with the RCS task that supports special education, the Arbor networks that support English language learners. And we have a lot, this is a big state, but we have a lot of partners who are there to help support our efforts so that we're not doing this alone. And they also serve as conduits to help us promote the efforts that we're doing and help turnkey some of that to at the local level.
I'm sorry.
Just a point of clarification. I know I have an accent. It is not nicet.
Nice said.
Nice said.
Said.
I'd just like to say one of the nice features of this plan, and I've been reading a lot of state plans because we're working with a number of states, is that these learning resources are integrated into the system of support and intervention that Stephen and colleagues have been developing. And so it's rather than sort of intervention over here and, you know, all this other stuff lives over there, it's really integrated into a more coherent and holistic approach that may make the resources more accessible to the schools that need them. Other comments and questions?
Yeah, I have one question. Stephen, you mentioned one of the ways in supporting schools identified is connecting schools and districts with other schools, districts, and professionals.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We have often had that discussion around this table, often met with difficulty in striving to do it. Is there more thought behind that method that you, or that one way of supporting schools that you can share with us at this point?
Sure. So one of the requirements of ESSA is that identified schools have to have an evidence-based intervention. And the plan that we propose is having schools approach this through looking at a school-wide intervention, intervention. In that initial year, we would identify potential interventions for schools to pursue that we would support through professional development and training. And so if schools were interested in that, then they could come to our professional development series, and they would also become sort of a professional learning committee or a community of practitioners by recognizing that they are invested in addressing an intervention together at the same time and become a learning community that way. Another way that we can do this is through the Reward School Recognition School program, where we identify schools that are able to make gains and identify specifically schools that are Title I schools that are surpassing expectations and connecting them with identified schools through serving as potential principal mentors or learning sites to bring other schools to.
And I just want to add the work that's been done with our MBK initiative through Stan's office and having opportunities for schools to actually share what's going well, give them strategies that they've used in their schools, and share that has been very helpful. And our plan is to provide more opportunities for those sharing. So that we also have done more opportunities for schools across the state that are working on our schools that have been identified already that are part of our plans to improve. Some of those schools have used strategies that have been particularly effective, and we've had opportunities for them to come and share those with other schools in the same group. So our receivership schools have done this twice now, and we've had very positive results around talking with other schools that are facing similar issues, but really can see with the data that they've been able to implement programs or strategies that have really worked for them.
Yes, I'm very encouraged by this, that we see ourselves, the state sees ourselves being partners with schools in the district. So it's a great shift, but I'm a little bit concerned about our capacity to do this work. If we are truly in a partnership and we offer all of these supports, whether or not it's financially, whether or not it's around professional support, my question then is that if we are partnership with these schools, do we hold ourselves accountable when the schools fail?
So let me respond.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point. So as we begin, I think it's very important for us to understand that we're going to have to look at all the resources that we have that we can use, put to bear to support these particular schools. And let me say, we are right now we are in serious trouble over the issues of not having our staff fully staffed. Okay, and I think that's an important factor. I know that that the state of New York is interested in having an approach that will be supportive of schools to really bring change. So our strategy obviously for working to make sure that we get the full staff that's necessary is important. We also have to look at the staff that we have and how we are using them to be out working with schools to understand the difficulties that they may be facing and what we can do to support them with some of our partners that Stephen mentioned. And I think it's extremely important to point out, we have on several occasions talked to the Regents about the role that the BOCES have taken. These are experts who are placed in, and they're practitioners themselves, placed in positions where they regionally support schools. And we think that it's very important that, for instance, they are aware of all of these factors and that they are working with the schools and the districts in their area, including providing some of these resources for some of the large cities that are close to them. I think we have to say in New York, we have been in a number of silos. It hasn't been as productive as it could be. We have, over the last 2 years, worked really hard to break down some of those. And I think we have to continue being very focused on doing that. But your point, Regent Chin, I think is important. We have to be held accountable, and we have to be able to say, we have been in that district, we have worked. And if a district, not the school, if the district needs to be called out, then I think we have to have the voice to do it. Because many of these schools are, in fact, in the situation that they're in. Mm-hmm. And although they're trying to work through some of these problems, very often district policy, district's approach, the district's not moving quickly enough to staff the school, et cetera, those things all contribute to a school being unable to really move the dime. And we've got to be able to say, these are the things that need to be happening to make sure all of the schools in your district are successful. We do want to hold ourselves accountable. We do have to beef up the staff that we have to do that, but we also have to look at what we're doing and make sure our partners are all on the same page. that if we're working with exceptional ed or we're working with English language learners, that they're not in separate buckets. They're all in the schools, and we need to work with each school in making sure that they address their needs.
This may be one of the most unpopular things I've ever had to say.
Now we're all really
That goes a long way.
Yeah. I gotta hear
Start with
this.
something positive. This has been great work, actually, in terms of identifying the role in which we want to play to support and provide technical assistance to school districts. So here's the big question, and it's not mentioned in here at all. Policy, fiscal decisions, budget decisions are made by members of local boards of education. That is not in here at all. What role do we want to play in educating our boards to get them to understand that they have to be partners in all of this, and in some way hold them accountable for the results of what happens in their districts? Now, I see my colleague from school boards back there saying, I don't believe you did that, Judith. But I've been a superintendent, and I understand that we have an obligation to educate our boards of education. In the absence of that, we give them freedom to set whatever goals they choose to. They have to become partners in all of this. Why don't I say it that way? They do have to become partners. So I'm going to suggest that somewhere in here, we begin to identify in supporting schools the roles that local boards of education need to play in transforming low-performing schools and in transforming all schools. I do think that Regent Young said something really important earlier that I don't think we should ever forget, and that is there are legislative actions that need to be taken, and we need to keep a list of what those legislative actions are, because absent fiscal support, I don't know how you do all of this. So I thank him for reminding us of this, and we need to be a little bit more political in moving forward. But that's my analysis.
Regent,
Could I make one?
Regent Johnson, we absolutely support your so-called unpopular, or however you want to classify it. I do think that I'm going to circle back where we started. This is our New York State plan with, if you recall, the commissioner talked about the governor signing this document. When you sign, it's a covenant, it is an agreement, it is a commitment. And part of that signature, we anticipate, is based on everyone who has worked hard on this document, everyone who has contributed, committed. That part of the commitment is resources, but part of the commitment is also a belief system that states in public action that we want to make a difference in the lives of our children. And the way that we do that is to embrace not only the technical plan, but our long-range plan that brings all the stakeholders, and I mean the governor, the legislators, the school boards, the superintendents, the parents, community-based organizations, all that passionately care about our children and are committed to putting the resources, putting the effort, putting the right alignments into educating all of our children. So this is really a call to action for all those who are committed and say that they believe that educating our children is the most important issue of our time. Then I say that it is a call to action. So, thank you.
I just wanted to note that there are a lot of little pieces in the plan of district elements, but they're not brought together in the way that you're describing, and that might be a really important thing for us to do as the plan evolves, is to really both the state and district elements. But Stephen, do you want to make a note about any of the elements that are scattered
Right.
about?
So we would be doing the annual cycles of resource reviews with districts that have identified schools. And also our hope is that by putting all this data out there about inequities, that can really prompt some action at the board level to address the inequities that are now publicly displayed.
Yes, thank you. I want to follow up Regent Johnson and Chin, specifically on two issues. One, the support for partnerships rather than being punitive has to take into account that there are receiverships in some cases where we have to take over or have others take over. And there are school districts where corrective action plans are in place or need to be in place. There's a monitoring of one school district. And so I wanted to know how you factor in the presence and the possibility of future actions like that in that larger partnership perspective. And my second question is, we keep talking about K to 12, and we make reference to other parts, but I don't really get a sense of how UPK, pre-K, 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds fits into this plan in terms of goals, in terms of expectations, even if we're able to have a say, because some of those students or children are under the Office of Children and Families purview, and in the city, something like in New York City, with seeing them talking about going to have the Department of Education to be responsible for all 3 and 4-year-olds in UPK, away from ACS, in a world of silos where we have not seen the Department of Ed doing things like home visits and all the other pieces that are part of early care, and that all the research shows are appropriate and necessary. So how do you, how do we in this plan fold in the preschool population that we keep talking about, P20, but I'm not sure that the plan is P20.
Do you want to speak to any of that, Stephen?
Well, I think part of this would come up in the district needs assessment process, where districts would be looking at some of the root causes that they may have identified for their performance. And this would be an opportunity for districts to be able to address those things so that they could put their attention toward, we need to establish a stronger early childhood program so that we don't have students coming in so far behind. And that would be a way that districts may be able to leverage that.
So I also want to point out that there is connection between the curriculum areas of pre-K into kindergarten. And Regent Reyes, as you know, and have worked so hard to try to move the opportunities for pre-K statewide. It isn't there yet. I think that some of the requirements that we have in our plans, separate plans that are done, the requirements that come through when districts receive grants, those particular districts have already aligned a number of these things. We have to make sure that that's happening. And we also have to continue as the regents, the commissioner, the chancellor, on all of us really focusing on trying to make sure that pre-K is a reality across the state of New York and not in just communities where a grant may be given. And I think that's an extremely important focus. We've had it this past a legislative session. We weren't successful there, but we need to keep pushing that agenda.
There's also a section in the plan regarding transitions, including transitions into school and from pre-K into elementary education. So that's a place where we can look to see if there are potential opportunities to strengthen that. And Regent Reyes, in terms of your question on receivership, even though, as Stephen has emphasized, we are looking primarily to be partners, there are requirements under ESSA that when schools do not improve, there have to be additional steps taken, and then that interacts with our own state law regarding receivership. So over time, if these schools do not improve, then they will end up in the receivership program.
That's schools, but when we're talking about corrective action plans, it's usually a school district. And so I'm hoping that we take into account in our plan the possibility, along with the actuality of corrective action plans that may be required or are required, that need to be monitored and folded in so that they become an integral part of the whole accountability plan.
And I also note that the Regents have for several years put forward a legislative proposal to give the commissioner more robust authority to intervene under certain circumstances in districts. So that's out there as well.
Very quick comments. One is resources from the state. We've talked about before setting up a list, as Lester has suggested, of all of the items in here that need to go to the legislature and added to our list that we submit to the legislature. One of which, and the commissioners pointed out, how important BOCES is. Well, we have probably 300 to 400 administrators on Long Island that make more money than our district superintendents on Long Island, and I think it's true elsewhere in places around the state because of the cap that's on there that we keep asking the legislature to remove. It seems to me it would be essential for what it is that we're looking for BOCES to do. I also want to, I don't know what US DOE will do, if at all, with our submission in September. We don't know what US DOE is going to do. But I think that the exercise that we're going through, and the reason that I support what we're doing, is that this is our plan. We will own this, whatever US DOE does, and I think it's important to note that they are almost superfluous to what it is that we're doing. And I just want to also support what Regent Johnson said unpopularly. I will add my unpopular tone to it. I've been a regent now for 13 years. I think that's longer than anybody else. We still have a couple of the same districts in my area that, due to a lot of factors, but especially due to the dysfunctionality of boards, are making very little progress. Sometimes the boards actually flaunt it, as they have in some of the audit reports that we've seen from a couple of our boards. The legislature so far has been unwilling, and we've been unwilling, to address the issue when a local board is just not functioning and there is academic real problems. There has to be a combination of those two things. And I don't know what the answer is, but we need to have some mechanism for at least identifying those areas to the public and to the legislature as being our concerns. We can't do anything about it, but we need to monitor it as we have a little bit, but also to broadcast it. And the last item that I have is, I don't know where in this report, or if we have anything in here, on the indicators, especially when it comes to school safety, other aspects of health and whatever else, for student and parent surveys as being one of the pieces of indicators in addition to our assessments and everything else. In other areas, student and recipient surveys of health services or whatever else are an important factor in whatever decisions they made about whether it's functioning well or not. And I think we ought to emphasize, or at least have some place for those surveys in here. And maybe we do.
We do.
I don't know.
We do.
Okay, good. And do they?
So we right now are piloting several surveys in districts across the state. We're actually anxious to move that. It's a tier 3, I believe, right now, and we're anxious to move them into either tier 2 or ultimately in tier 1. That would take time, as you're aware, and we've talked about that. But clearly, having that opportunity gets to a number of the issues that Regent Cottrell brings up about the safety and the feeling of safety in a school that a child and a family has. And that is also connected to the work that we're doing with community schools and providing resources from that community in schools. We have a long way to go, but we have had funding for 2 years now from the legislature, and we have clear guidance out for districts that give them an indication of the importance of that, and the research around the factors that are really contribute to academic success when a child feels safe and their social emotional health is taken care of, then they're much more successful.
Thank you. So on page 59, the bullet in the middle of the page, it struck me as offering options for parent voice to be heard in decision making. I'm concerned that this bullet is so deep into the presentation and that our focus on parent and community engagement is really, I think we have it listed as tier 3. So recognizing that parent and community engagement is not required under ESSA the way it was under NCLB, I just want to ask my colleagues to consider as we go through this, if we've got respect between schools and families is a guiding principle in this plan. When we talk about things like implementing the next generation of learning standards as part of this plan, when we talk about supporting students' social emotional well-being, chronic absenteeism, the access to advanced coursework, and keeping students on track for graduation, I mean, all of these things really require some robustness in a parent engagement model.
That's right.
And maybe we can't direct districts specifically as to how they would implement such a model, but I implore you all that as we go through this and finalize it, that we think about placing it in a tier 2 as opposed to a tier 3. Thank you.
Let me just reiterate the point that Scott made earlier, that the labeling of the tiers does not pertain to their importance, but to the immediate availability of an indicator or a measure.
Right.
And so that is an agenda that the Regents could decide to take on, developing a measure that really allows you to look across districts in a very specific way.
I mean, I guess I should also add that, we've got it here as a tool within supporting schools that need improvement, right? So we're kind of doing it as an intervention
rather than
from the outset.
Yeah. So I think it's a great point.
Thank you.
Actually, Regent Mead, in the public-facing document, we do have it for everyone, and then we emphasize more of it before the school improvement.
Okay, then,
Just to my colleague's point, and again, for future discussions, it would probably be helpful if staff could, and maybe Ira is also the historian, but perhaps Ira could outline for my colleagues the history of parent involvement. And I mean
we
this.
Go way back.
But there have been policies, and there have been plans, and there have been lots of things that have occurred, and I think it would be important for us to know what they were before we start making more recommendations that we can't implement. And so it might, because I think you're absolutely right. I circled it as well. But I think it's a much larger issue beyond the application. So it just seems to me that if we could have that information, that might inform what we do going forward.
No, that would take another Regents meeting. Yes. Right. I think the other thing is that, Commissioner, I know that the team has talked about translating in terms of what Regent Young just said and Regent Mead, taking the document and making it very parent-friendly. Because I think, Regent Mead, you have said many times, show me a school that parents are very involved, and I will show you, and I mean very involved in so many different ways, and I will show you a successful school. So I think that part of this is to, not only in the public facing, which it is there, but to make sure that, again, in our own document, not so much the technical, really make that part of the fabric, and to have a document that speaks to the parents' role, parents' involvement, parents' voice will be an exceptional piece in terms of this work. So thank you for raising that.
Are we ready to move on?
Ready to move on.
Okay, great. So, a great conversation. This is really important work. We're going to talk about the sort of companion component here, which is supporting excellent educators. And I'm going to turn this over to Alex in a moment, but I'll just point out a couple of things. That the plan really takes a career-long focus to this question, not just beginning teachers, but really from recruitment through retention to accomplished practice. And even the notion of national board certified educators is noted in the equity component of the plan, something that is something that could be part of an investment strategy. I'll note that retention is a huge part of the question of equity in having an equitable distribution of qualified teachers, along with recruitment. And the plan, and interestingly, retention of teachers, which is a huge issue for supply, demand, and shortages, because 90% of new demand comes from attrition of teachers in this country. Our attrition rates are about twice as high as those of high-achieving countries like Finland and Singapore. And to keep teachers longer, they need to be better prepared, because well-prepared teachers stay at 2 to 3 times higher rates than teachers who are underprepared. They need to be well mentored and inducted, because that also contributes to retaining teachers. And they need good leadership, because teachers stay longer in schools where principals are supportive and create a collegial, collaborative environment. And so this plan also has a very strong component around leadership, which is a very important piece, including the use of newly available resources under Title II to build stronger leadership development. And it has strong emphasis on the clinical experience that teachers and leaders bring into the profession, so that they're really well prepared for their jobs. So I think there are a number of really important and innovative components. I'm going to turn it over to Alex to tell you all the details.
Thank you, Linda. I think you actually framed some of these things the same way that I was planning to frame them. So what I will say is really what we know and what research confirms is that among school-based factors, nothing matters more than instruction to improving student outcomes. And really, research shows that the thing that matters next most is strong leadership. And it's often about what leaders are doing in school buildings to support teachers and to create team teaching environments and those kinds of things that actually have the greatest impact, right? So that is not to discount the importance of out-of-school factors, but it is to say that by improving the quality of our educator workforce, we have an opportunity to level the playing field to try to ensure that all students meet that goal of graduating college, career, and civic ready. Right, so that's sort of the general framing on this. So as Linda said, the way that we are thinking about this, it's not on the slide, but just to let you all know, it is in the plan and the public-facing summary. One of the key components of our strategy in this section of the application are to produce both state-level and district-level equity reports. So those reports examine the rates at which at the state level, but also within each district, the rates at which students are assigned to inexperienced, out-of-field, and ineffective educators. We combine that with other information about retention, turnover, all of those kinds of things. This is all information that we currently collect at the State Education Department, and we're pushing it back out. We're planning to push it back out to school districts in a usable way. The point of that report is it's the starting point for a facilitated root cause analysis, right? We would like to help districts understand the key factors that are impacting their ability to ensure all students have access to that qualified, experienced, and effective workforce. So grounded in that is the first bullet that you see here on the equitable access to effective teachers section, right? So we are proposing to support school districts, BOCES, higher education, and other preparation programs to provide comprehensive systems of educator support that address 5 common challenge areas, and those areas are preparation, recruitment and hiring, professional development and growth, retention, and extending the reach, which are those opportunities for career advancement. The key part of this strategy is also to thinking about pipeline earlier on, right? So there is, historically, when we've talked about recruitment and placement, we've been thinking about how school districts recruit and place candidates once they complete their preparation programs. But part of the strategy here is to identify promising candidates early on, so to work with higher education to do that work, so that we can get people into the profession that show promise. So moving on from that sort of broad framing, we're thinking about different sort of buckets of work that we believe at the state level will improve or can help to improve equitable access to a high-quality workforce. And so the first piece of that is clinical preparation. So exploring enhancements to clinical preparation for both teachers and school leaders, working to expand programs that provide greater opportunities for candidates to take the things that they're learning in their coursework and apply them in an authentic setting, creating tools and other resources that will help facilitate feedback loops between prep programs and the school districts where candidates are ultimately placed to ensure that programs can be refined over time. Another important part of this strategy is looking at our existing pathways to certification. We have alternate pathways to certification. There is an individual evaluation process that happens, but what we want to do is we want to ensure that the pathways that currently exist to becoming a certified teacher or school leader in New York State do not have the unintended consequence of impacting the supply of high-quality candidates, right? So, and this is particularly important for emerging and hard-to-staff subject areas, so we'll be taking a look at that. The next piece, again, moving along that continuum, are supports for new and early career educators. So looking at our current mentoring requirements, thinking about induction models, so moving beyond that first-year mentoring requirement to just providing comprehensive systems of support to early career educators so that we can retain them and so they can have the support that they need to become effective earlier on in their career. And then we move on into sort of it's not here on this slide, but I think it actually might be on the next one. It is this idea of providing opportunities for advancements. So can we leverage the state's career ladder pathways framework to put career ladders into place that allow teachers and school leaders with sort of a demonstrated record of effectiveness to serve as mentors, models for their peers, that sort of idea. So in exchange for taking on those additional roles and responsibilities, they are recognized in their school district, compensation or otherwise. And then, as Linda said, another key linchpin here is supporting school leaders. So we are looking at leveraging sort of some of the work that we've been doing with the Principal Preparation Project, looking at the state's leadership standards, mentoring requirements, certification of school leaders, all of that to ensure that every teacher has a principal who can support them and that principals can create cultures in their buildings that are culturally responsive and that are meeting the needs of all students. So I did it fast because I know we're running short on time, but I'm hoping that's good framing for this section.
Comments or questions?
Thank Thank you, Alex. That was very informative, helpful. Regent Tillett?
Two things. One, Friday, there is a meeting, and I hope this really coincides with what we're talking about of the National Board work group that reported to us a couple of times already and trying to figure out how to implement some of their proposals on creating, in essence, a teacher ladder. And I'm hoping that it will fit right into this, and they need to see this as well as we need to see their report, and hopefully we'll be there. My question is, without Title IIA, which it is likely not to be there, given what I've seen, how are we going to ensure that this very, very urgent and important part of what we're proposing in ESSA is accomplished? We have to have a program like this, and yet we've been relying on 2A, and the legislature has not given us a thing to promote this. And I don't see how we're going to do it, but we have to. And I don't know how.
Okay. So one of the things I want to say, the 2A, remember we had the skinny budget that came out from the federal, it was called the skinny budget, but it was well over 100 pages long. At any rate, in there, Title II was totally wiped out. You remember we shared that information with you. More recent budget information we've received that there is, Title II is included in the budget up through 17, so we'll be able to rely on that for a period of time. I think your warning is well taken, but at this point in time, we do understand that we will have some funding from in Title II.
For how long?
Well,
Through
September? Let me look at that ball
No,
and
is it
see
through-
if I can figure this
is it
one
the whole
out.
year, or is it just through
No, it's
September?
through December, and we're hoping, obviously, we're going to have a new budget coming up. But I think that reflects back on the comments that we've talked about, that legislators across the country realize the importance of professional development, both for teachers and for leaders, and this particular plan allows for that. And I think our comments have traditionally and continue to be to both US DOE and to our legislators. We have a new plan. We're doing these really, we think, very comprehensive approach in New York to make sure that we can support our districts and our schools for student success. And to be able to get there, we need the access to the funding that has been in place before. So I know Linda was going to
Yeah, I was just going to try to be a little bit optimistic because what comes in the president's budget is not necessarily what gets adopted by the legislature. And because the ESSA was passed by a bipartisan Congress with strong, support from Republicans as well as Democrats, the conversation in the legislature in Washington is about continuing to fund the components of ESSA. So we can't say for sure, but one could anticipate that there would be some
vouch
resources.
for it.
I can't vouch for it, but I can pass that on.
Thank you. The first part of on page 61, slide 61, actually 60, says equitable access to effective teachers. And in those 2 pages, what I'm not clear about is the issue of equitable access to diverse teachers. And I'm talking about race and ethnicity in terms of Black and Latino teachers across the fields, whether they're hard to staff positions, whether they're early childhood or ELL or any special ed. And the second part of the concern is the teachers be prepared linguistically and culturally competent and responsive to the diverse student body of New York, the increasingly diverse student body of New York State. And I'm not clear where, if anywhere, those issues which are critical to urban areas as well as rural areas and suburban areas. The low number of Black and Latino males is being addressed through grant funding, through the leadership of Regent Young and the board and the commission, with the help of the legislature. But that's a grant. And we're trying to build something for the ages, right? We have end goals. And I'm not clear of whether our end goals include a pathway to diverse student preparation and the curriculum development and professional development through the not pathway, the ladder, family, para, teacher, leader, in terms of being competent to teach kids who are gifted, who have disabilities, who are migrant, etc.
That's a lot.
I know it is.
It's a lot, it's important.
But it's missing.
Yeah, I'm going to ask that the Chancellor briefly comment on it.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that part of what I really want us to keep in mind that throughout the document, again, it's the technical document has pieces that you will see throughout. The full document has also additional pieces in terms of the issue of cultural responsiveness and diversity. There's a tremendous, because I think, as many of you know, we've spent an enormous amount of time around this issue of diversity, the issue of cultural and language, language diversity, but more importantly around cultural responsiveness, even when the higher, in terms of training teachers and teacher mentoring and preparation. So what I want us to do, as Vice Chancellor have said, is while we zoom in on certain pieces, that we don't lose sight of the entire comprehensive document that does, and even in some sections, it's very intentional on some of these issues. So that if you don't necessarily see it in a particular section, it doesn't mean that it's not there. I think it's so important to look at the comprehensive full document as a way of seeing the gestalt of the entire intent and the entire picture. Thank you.
Alex, did you want to point to?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's also it's not just in the larger plan itself, it's in that public-facing
Right,
summary.
correct.
If you look at the supporting excellent educators section of the application, we actually do talk about the fact that those equity reports that we're proposing to produce include information on teacher and principal demographics, and there's intentional language that's in there saying that where that is an issue for a particular school district, we would work with them to make sure on initiatives that would help them have a workforce that mimics their student population. And then there is also language in here about the preparation program requirements, the continuing professional development requirements that speak to the importance of being culturally responsive. So that all is in the summary document. We were just trying to balance with the slides how high level versus specific to be.
Understood. We have a couple more topics to move into. I do know that there are a couple of questions. I'm going to entertain those questions now, and then I really want to leave some time as we wind down today. Ms. Cash.
Yes, briefly, I totally agree with you, Mr. Trinkelinis, with respect to the shortage of teachers. We went to a conference in October, and there is a shortage of teachers, and in New York State, certainly that is the case. And career ladders was a critical dimension, as you suggested, so I totally agree with that, as well as accompanying it with appropriate remuneration. In terms of certification, we have to make sure, and I think we are starting to do that thanks to the leadership of our Chancellor and Commissioner, that we make certain that in all of this, we do a bottom-up formulation of policy, not mandated top down. If you do bottom up, then you work out the kinks, and it's a living thing that can be changed if we need to have if we did something wrong or we made a misjudgment. So bottom up is critical in terms of making certification policy. And the career ladder is important for people to be attracted to go to mentoring or part-time teaching and part-time coaching or some combination of the two to give them some options. Because being a teacher, whilst the most significant profession, it is very, very draining. And so you need options, really, really, too.
Alexander, you mentioned a root cause analysis to design a particular improvement plan for a school that needs support. What would trigger a root cause analysis? Achievement or graduation rates, those two?
So for this particular section of the plan, when we produce those district level equity reports that show where there are gaps between different subgroups of students in access to effective, out-of-field, and experienced educators, the districts where those gaps are the most severe are the ones that we're proposing to focus on in any given school year, and then where there is overlap between schools that have been identified for comprehensive and targeted support, we would, of course, coordinate efforts.
Thank you. I'm going to ask that we move on to the next topic.
Great. Thank you very much. And let me just add to this teacher shortage discussion one point, which is that as you think about the kinds of proposals you'll take both within the Regents and to the legislature, it's really important that high retention pathways to teaching be emphasized, because if you can keep people in, and these are things like forgivable loans, service scholarships, residency models where people stay, then you reduce the demand and the churn and so on. So there is reference to some of this in the plan, and that's going to be important. The other thing that is always the elephant in the room that keeps getting referred to is the inequality in funding to districts in the state, which leads to inequality in salary levels and working conditions and so on. And that's going to be one of those things that has to continue to be raised regularly if that problem is going to be solved in the long run. But there's a lot of really productive strategies to support all of the local work that are really thought through well in the plan. Do you guys want me to just send this over, or you want to come around, Lisette? Why don't you come around so people can see you? It's your beautiful
Good
face.
idea.
We're going to move to English language and multilingual learners, Title III. This is the last major section that we're going to talk about. Because it is such an important issue in New York State. I would just like to note about this part of the plan that it's really a very sophisticated conceptualization of how to work on behalf of English learners, rooted in research about the acquisition of language proficiency, and Lisette will describe how that plays out.
Thank you, Linda. Good morning, everyone. I think we all have a renewed sense of urgency around the education of English language learners, multilingual learners. And so today we are presenting to you the product of a lot of work, a lot of data analysis to make sure that we actually have an equitable and reliable system of accountability for English language learners. And basically we have it's a summary of the ideas of many conversations we have with different stakeholders. And number one, our goal is to set a set of goals that are attainable, that they are challenging, but that would allow students to become English proficient, right? And secondly, one of the provisions that we are putting forth through this regulation is this idea that recently arrived English language learners will continue to be exempt for 1 year of the ELA. However, in the second year, we are going to be using the results of the ELA not for accountability or achievement, but to set the baseline. That's the key to us because it would allow students to give them more time, right, to acquire language. And thirdly, we had analyzed a number of different models and that we can use to actually measure not only achievement but growth of English proficiency. And so what we are proposing to you today is the transition matrix. And it's important to say that we took a look at it, not just internally, but also with the work group as well as experts in this area, Kenji and Pete, talking about what this means. And so let's talk a little bit about this model. And so basically, this is a grid, right, that shows how we are going to intend to measure English proficiency. And the importance of this model is that it begins with the English proficiency of the child, the initial level of the child. If you look at the grid, to the left, we have the different levels in which these students can come in, right? The 1.25 that you see there in year 2 is basically the target, right? But it's not a target to actually become proficient, it's the growth that the students were going to make. And for us, that's really important because it's a model that is transparent, is robust. We know that when we took a look at the other analysis of the other models, although they were all in the same line in terms of results, this one proved to be more transparent and more in alignment with our assessment and also the analysis of the data that we did. And that was really key for us, being able to articulate it and also being able to show the English proficiency natural trajectory of the child. And so what you have in this slide is basically a representation of one of the quartiles that are inside one performance level, right? And so what that means is that we are not just measuring, let's say, from entering to transitioning. What we are doing is ensuring that growth goes between quartiles. And maybe this graph will be even more helpful. So when you look at the different levels, you see that these different colors represent the different quartiles that the child can grow, right? When you look at the entering, let's suppose that I am entering, right? I have to move up each of these quartiles. If I actually make progress and become, let's say, transitioning in the second quartile, even if it is in the lower number, I am meeting my target of 1.25. And so I think that when we look at the work that we are doing with this type of model, it's not just about, and I want to emphasize that, it's not about just the proficiency, right? But also showing the growth that these children are making. This is going to allow us to actually teachers to be able to teach more efficiently and more effectively, because then we are going to target where these children are. And so I think that in essence, New York is proposing this because we want to ensure, again, that we have equitable and reliable process of accountability for ELS, but most importantly, give students sufficient time, right, to become English proficient. And I have to say that everything that we are doing today, that we are presenting to you today, and that we will put forth to the USDOE is based on analysis from New York, right? We took a look at the data, we took a look at our assessment, and so what we are presenting is rooted in what we have learned throughout this year and the different types of analysis that we have done, to be able to come today and say that this is what we think is our best thinking collectively of what we would like to see moving forward for New York. We are very ambitious, and I know that ESA is asking us to be that way. I think that that renewed sense of urgency is what it brings us to have a very rigorous but attainable goal for ELS in New York State. Thank you.
Great. And so this is, where's our little clicker?
All right.
So nice. We still have a few others.
I know before we move into the last
Yep.
section,
Comments and questions?
I just one question for clarification. We're just using the nicest slots to do the entrance assessment.
The entrance, the identification assessment is the NICETEL, but for the purposes of measuring English proficiency will be the nicest slot, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Just a question of how the matrix and these progressions fit into the long-term goal and end goal that we were talking about earlier, as far as proficiency and meeting targets.
So this model is basically measuring English proficiency for the child, right? When we talk about the long-term goals, we're talking about, in general, how many students within that school are going to be making progress for that amount of years. And that's how all come together. So if I have a group of students, and I think Scott mentioned it and Ira as well, that we have 49% of our students currently making progress towards the goal. I think all of this comes together, the data that we gather from each student, to be able to come as a group to meet that target that we have set forth of whatever percentage we decide, with the long-term goal of being 95% of all students making progress towards becoming proficient.
Does the ESSA plan allow for the progress, growth, proficiency of former Ls and current Ls to be reported separately or together? Because this is all about current Ls, no?
It is about current Ls, but we are definitely reporting former Ls data as well. Go ahead, Ira, you want to?
I was just going to say, Regent Reyes, there are two different things going on here. There is the performance of English language learners as a subgroup, in which case we can include former English language learners for a period of up to 4 years. So that's when we're measuring the performance of English language learners in ELA and math, graduation rate. This is about the acquisition of English proficiency by current English language learners. So the only students who are part of this analysis are those students who are currently English language learners.
Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on this? All right, nice job. So we are close to time, I know, and I want to respect the schedule and your patience and your stamina that you have demonstrated this morning. There is a lot of other material in ESSA. It's in your, last time I checked, 160-page long report. It might be more than that by now.
Much more. 187 to be exact.
Okay, thank you, but who's counting? And then, reduced into the public-facing document. So you can see that there are the other titles. We just heard about Title III, Title IIA we heard about, and then special populations of students. This is a very quick summary of some of the ways in which students, migratory students, students who are in juvenile detention facilities labeled by the laws we heard earlier, neglected or delinquent, homeless youth, and so on, are supported in the law. Some of the key things in New York are using new fiscal transparency reports so we really can follow where the money goes as it's spent on these students, making sure that there's more access to curriculum for students in various contexts, and also making sure that they can earn credits, for example, and carry them back into the school system if they're in juvenile detention for a period of time, making sure that supplemental academic interventions and support are available. And so there's quite a bit of detail around the ways in which the state is taking responsibility for ensuring that students who are in distinctive settings and experiencing distinctive challenges receive supports. I'll just point to kind of the major headings along this left-hand column here, the left-hand most column on the slide that I think characterize the goals that the plan really emphasizes. As I noted, the goal of learning for all students, that students don't disappear, but that there are efforts to be sure that they're getting the curriculum that they need, and that they're getting the support services. Also, there's a set of funds and opportunities and plans associated with being sure that schools are safe, that bullying and harassment are addressed, and that punitive and exclusionary responses to student behavior are reduced, suspensions are reduced. Some of these things can be reinforced as you develop your different tiers of indicators that say how you're going to look at schools, and then there are programs to really help schools learn new approaches to strengthening social and emotional learning, safe and responsive cultures and climates. There's a set of initiatives around safety for students that go with those, strong school, home and school partnerships that are intended to engage parents and family members, and robust school and community partnerships that will help integrate health providers, mental health providers, after-school providers. Again, these can be reinforced, particularly with resources for schools that are receiving additional support and intervention as part of that set of responses to their needs as they are going through diagnostics. But there is a statewide approach as well. And then finally, these are the other key goals that are articulated: developing digital literacy skills, including school library programs that allow kids access to digital tools, the well-rounded education that can come more easily for schools that have school-wide programs and making that more plausible for more schools. And then, as I said, the supports for migratory students in juvenile facilities and foster care and homeless youth. So I'm just going to stop there with that broad summary. If there are specific questions, staff are here to answer those. I'll pause before we thank everyone.
All right, are there, Regent Johnson? This would be really helpful if it was.
Regent Johnson, will you pull your mic down? Thank
This
you.
would be really helpful if you could align this with what have we learned over the past 10 years that suggests this is a direction we need to go in, so that there is an acknowledgement that we've had 10 years of NCLB. There have been a number of disappointments and failures, and there's an assumption, I assume, about what is represented in the left-hand column. So it would be helpful. Is there a relationship between what you are presenting now and the experiences of the past 10 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think partly what you may be alluding to is, for example, we saw under the incentive structure in NCLB that quite often the curriculum got narrowed, only to English language arts and math, and there wasn't a well-rounded curriculum. That the emphasis on, ensuring that scores were the only things that improved led sometimes to neglecting some other features of education and some students who were not near the proficiency bubble or were easier to get rid of than to educate if the incentives were to be met. So actually one of the nice things about the public-facing plan is there's a set of things that say what we heard, what we did, and what has changed. And some of it's captured there, but I think you're asking for perhaps a more complete analysis of how the plan responds to what we've learned. And you can see the emphasis on building capacity, really taking a well-rounded curriculum seriously, ensuring that it's available to all students. And those, I think, are parts of the learning that have occurred over that 10-year period.
I would also imagine that the thousands, actually, of voices that came from stakeholders may have found its way into this.
Absolutely.
So it would be really helpful to acknowledge the work of the stakeholders and to let them know that this is a result of what they have proposed in addition to the work that we've done, because up to this point, by the way, I don't see any thank you to the stakeholders, and there are lots
There's
of
supposed to
folks.
be a slide, which
There
I
is
don't
a
hear.
slide. I did it at the very beginning. I appreciate you
okay.
bringing that up. In fact, when
I
you
was about to thank the
when you pointed
stakeholders.
it out to us, Regent Johnson, we immediately added the 2 slides at the
Okay.
beginning. I started with those.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
I'm not going to let you get by with that, Regent Johnson. Come on.
Thank you. My brings us to 12:30.
We did it.
We did do it. I want to allow Linda to say any closing words, but before you do that, I just want to say thank you to the presenters, both you, Linda, and Scott, and all the members of this is very important work, and Roger, you said it well, that we're talking about something that ESSA requires, but when all is said and done, this is something that we will own. And I believe it's important that we continue to put all the
Are we?
things that's
Are we
important
coming
for our
back here?
mission on
No?
the plate
Yeah.
as we continue towards submission. And also
Oh,
remember
yeah.
that this is a
Yeah,
draft.
this isn't so.
We will now
Right.
have input from the public.
That's the
During
other
this
question.
meeting, we rolled
Right.
out to the public our, what we are intending to do with our plan. We'll have additional input.
Is this the
And
same
again,
as what-
we'll continue to come back to a lot of the questions and comments that were voiced here. Obviously, we weren't able to address all the comments and answer all the questions fully, but we will have time to do that. The important thing today was to get the plan out and to get a lot of the issues, our concerns and questions onto a plate that we will continue to work from.
Right.
And also, I want to mention that, Linda, we are not done with you. You will be with us this afternoon.
Scott too. Scott and Jen.
Scott and Jen, yeah.
So we'll have, it does sound threatening. We're not done with you yet. Linda will provide, and Scott will provide us with a summary and next steps, which is important.
Good.
And one thing I would like to just reiterate, you have the slide presentation, and as you know, slides can't be as full as sometimes those who've worked on something would like them to be. I would urge you and the public, I'm saying this for the people in the audience as well, to make sure that you you look to see what is in our public-facing document, and then ultimately, and Linda's pointed it out, and Scott did as well, that the descriptions in the large actual application are very thorough. And so some of the things you've mentioned are in those other documents. And so anyone who's interested, look there so that you can get the full effect of the work that's been done by all of our stakeholders and all of our staff in putting those ideas together. So thank you very much, and thanks again to everyone who's contributed to this. Outside of SED and outside of what has traditionally been the roles that we've put in on people to be part of an educational plan, we have many non-traditionalists who've been part of this, but we'd also like to thank all of the people that are here today that will live it as we move forward. Thank you.
Can I make a comment about the Regents? This discussion today is indicative, I think, of something that wasn't here 13 years ago. This discussion never could have been held 13 years ago as in the Regents Board. I believe everyone on the board made a comment today that would be unheard of in the past. This is a new Regents Board. It is one that is so refreshing to hear the comments from people who really understand education. For me, it's enlightening, and I give credit to the Chancellor and the Commissioner for and the board members for really letting this happen. I think it's a great step forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So can we?